We're on a really tight schedule, as I've mentioned. So introductions to speakers are simply going to be the name of the speaker, their title, and the name of their presentation. But you should have all speaker bios in the conference program, so please just refer to this for more detail. As I said, we've got a really tight schedule, so without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Matthew Ashton, who is Director of Public Health for Liverpool City Council. And Matt is also lead DPH for Food Active. And Matt's going to give a short introduction to both Food Active and to the main themes of today's conference. Many thanks, Matt. Over to you.
Cheers, Matthew. Thank you very much. I'm obviously delighted to be here this morning to open the conference. As Matthew said, I'm Matthew Ashton, Director of Public Health for Liverpool, but also Lead Director of Public Health for Food Active, and it's my absolute privilege to be so. We have a fantastic, small but perfectly formed team working really hard to support you all and the wider system on this incredibly important agenda. I'm just going to give a quick reminder of who we are. So Food Active is a collaborative healthy weight program delivered by the Health Equalities Group and commissioned by local authority public health teams, NHS organisations and public health teams at both the regional and national level. Food Active is one of two programmes delivered by the Health Equalities Group. Our sister organisation, Healthy Stadia, is a European charity which promotes the health of visitors, fans, players, employees and the surrounding community. And we work closely with Healthy Stadia on a number of projects, including the Give Up Loving Pop campaign and Healthy Matchmark. Food Active was set up in 2013 by the Northwest Directors of Public Health. The Northwest Obesity Task Force was officially launched as Food Active in 2014. And as you know, the programme focuses on advocacy, on targeted interventions, on research and strategic partnerships to drive forward policy calls. Originating in the northwest of England, Food Active supports local authorities across the region, both on an individual level and also, importantly, taking a collaborative approach to promoting healthy weight. And more recently, the Food Active programme has worked to support local authorities across England, from the northeast and Yorkshire and Humber to the southwest, to help drive forward that healthy weight agenda. So Food Active network is composed of a network of local authorities originating in the northwest, but it's now grown to encompass all regions in the north of England as well as others in the southwest. We're an independent collective voice of local authorities, all with the same objectives of promoting healthy weight locally. We're an independent charity. We're able to lobby and communicate sensitive and political issues. We are a collective to share good practice, and finally a forum for learning and discussion, with today's conference being a really good example of that. So what we do, Food Active's core aim is to address the social, environmental, economic and legislative factors which influence people's lifestyle choices and behaviours, with a specific focus on healthy weight. And we have three key aims that frame our annual work programme. So we work to influence policy pertaining to healthy weight at both the local and national level. We deliver interventions and campaigns to promote healthier weight with a focus on populations who suffer the greatest level of health inequality. And we undertake research and develop strategic partnerships to lobby and advocate on issues pertaining to unhealthy weight and the impact of both food and the built environment. I'd just like to give a few reflections on the last 20 months. It's been a really difficult period for all of us as we've responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as try to carry on with our usual, in inverted commas, work programme. Over the last year, I've worked with the widest set of partners I've ever worked with in public, private and voluntary community faith sectors, responding to that health emergency. Healthy weight in the UK continues to be a health emergency, impacting on the health and well-being of our population significantly and with a very specific inequalities angle. And therefore, in my view, it is absolutely correct that we respond to this challenge in the same way. A whole system working together to address the wider determinants of health required to ensure sustainable change to these populations. And moving on to today's conference theme, weight stigma presents a significant barrier for people living with obesity and can lead to a widening of health inequalities. Weight stigma creates a narrative that blames individuals wholly for their weight status, and today's conference is intended to offer a range of evidence that challenges this false narrative. We want to bring the conversation on addressing weight stigma to our local authority network and wider following through academic research, lived experience and policy interventions. And in addition, Food Active will be launching our own dedicated resource hub on our website towards the end of this conference. This hub will contain loads of really useful resources and tools for you to use to help eliminate weight stigma from your own areas of work. Together, I know that we can help to eliminate that really important weight stigma agenda. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I hope you have a fantastic day. We've got some really good speakers lined up, so please do listen, reflect, engage, and work with us to help address weight stigma and the wider food agenda. Have a really good day. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt. Thanks for that introduction and for your role or ongoing role in terms of supporting Food Active. It is much appreciated. We're going to move on now to Angela Chesworth, who is a patient advocate. And Angela is going to talk about obesity through a different lens. So if you want to pop your slides up, Angela, and share your screen. So it's over to Angela now.
Thank you, Matthew. Hello, my name is Angela Chesworth, and I'm a person living with obesity. I've been invited today to share some of my experiences in the hope that the next time you see a person in a larger body, you may see them through a different lens. I have struggled with my ever-increasing weight from childhood. Many years of diets, Cabbage Diet, Atkins, Slimming World, Weight Watchers, the list is endless. I would lose the pounds only to regain them and more. What was I doing wrong? Why can't I maintain my weight? I'm such a failure. I need to try harder. My heaviest weight to date has been 24 stone. In 2013, I received bariatric surgery, a gastric bypass. I lost 12 stone in the first year. 8 years post-surgery and 2 stone regain, today I am maintaining a 10 stone weight loss. No high blood pressure, no obstructive sleep apnea. I'm far healthier and happier. However, I still live in fear that I will one day return to my heaviest weight. I would like to ask you some questions. I don't want you to answer, they are purely for you to think about. Do you have a mother or father, sister or brother, a partner, best friend, neighbour or work colleague who is overweight or living with obesity? Have you ever made fun of a person because of their size? Have you ever shared a funny picture on social media? Commented to a friend on how the big person is dressed? Joined in with a group of friends who are making who ate all the pie jokes? Nudged your friend and pointed whilst puffing out your cheeks? Rolled your eyes because you're sat next to the only empty seat on the bus, knowing they are coming your way? Looked into a person's shopping trolley in a supermarket and thought, well, no wonder they're big. Well, the person living with obesity sees this judgment. They hear the laughter, they feel the disgust, every single one of us, including the people in your life who are living with overweight and obesity. I too have made them jokes and had those thoughts. We live in a world of judgment, but when does our judgment turn into stigma and bias? I would like to invite you to put yourself in the patient's shoes. I recall my first appointment with a dietitian was at the age of 10 years old. Nobody spoke to me. The conversation was aimed at my mother. The assumption was made that to my parents that I was eating too many sweets and not being active. All I was being judged on was how I looked. In reality, I was being physically and mentally abused every single day by my classmate. I would have to give her a chocolate bar and 20 pence or she would beat me up. She would tell me, it's for your own good, I'm stopping you getting fatter. I never told anybody because she was right. I was fat, and if I told someone, they would agree with her. My mother stopped giving me pocket money as part of my diet plan, so I turned to theft. I would steal milk from our neighbour's doorstep so I could keep the money my mother had given me to buy the milk. just so my bully wouldn't hit me. If I had no money, I would drink vinegar and put my fingers down my throat to make myself vomit so I didn't have to go to school. After a number of years, I couldn't take any more. It was our first day in senior school and my bully approached me demanding £1 every day and a chocolate bar. Something inside me just snapped. I picked up a brick and hit her in the face with it, breaking her nose. I was expelled with the incident on my record. Nobody cared when I told them how she had bullied me. Physical violence is unacceptable, I was told. At the age of 10, I had become a thug, a thief, and a liar, all because of how I was treated because of the body I lived in. As an adult, I've been spat at in the street. I've been verbally abused whilst working out in a gym. I've been refused promotion because I wasn't the right image, even though I have been doing the job for over a year. I've been told by strangers I should die so people who are genuinely sick can get help. I've spent 30 plus years feeling a failure and still struggle with these feelings today. All I've ever been told by my healthcare professionals, TV, media, governments, society, friends, family, and my own internal thoughts is to eat less and move more. Comments like, "You have done this to yourself," "You need to stop eating," "Only you can change," "You have no willpower," "You need to try harder." The list is endless. To eat healthy and be active will help anyone to become healthier. However, if you're a person living with obesity, the complexities need to be recognised and addressed. I've spent thousands of pounds on slimming clubs, fat burning tablets, gym memberships, aerobic classes, Zumba, expensive plus size gym clothes, all because I was desperate to lose weight. I just wanted to be normal. I just wanted to fit in. I worked a 10-hour night shift, filling shelves for a well-known supermarket, followed by a 2-hour gym session with a personal trainer 3 times a week. But nobody sees this. They just see my obesity and believe I chose to do this to myself because I lack willpower, I'm lazy and a glutton. You may never have witnessed weight stigma or bias, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. My first ever smear test, I was asked to lay on the floor as I was too big for the examination table. I felt so humiliated, it took 20 years before I returned for my second ever test. I was so ashamed of my body. Why could I not lose weight no matter how hard I tried? I attended a general practitioner's appointment as I had an ingrowing toenail, and I was told, and I quote, "You need to go away and come back when you're not so fat." No treatment, no advice, just humiliation. My ingrowing toenail became infected. The pain was unbearable and I could hardly walk. I knew I needed medical help, so I booked an appointment with a new doctor at my surgery. Feeling very anxious, I sat in front of her and I explained about my toe, and after examination, she set out a treatment plan. She then changed my life forever. She asked me, "Can we have an open and honest conversation about your health? How do you sleep at night? Is there anything you constantly worry about? How are things at home? How is work?" She told me, "I'm worried about your weight and the effect it can be having on your health. I know how difficult it is and I want to help you." For the first time, I had the confidence to open up. I have been seen as Angela and not just excess fat. I wanted to talk because my doctor wanted to listen. As I left the room, I was called back. "Angela, I'm here for you." For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone. This one conversation was not only life-changing, but life-saving. I was referred to weight management and I was diagnosed with sleep apnea and high blood pressure. I began a 2-year program of support from specialist dietitians, psychologists, physiotherapists, and weight management consultants, a multidisciplinary team to treat a multifactorial disease. After 2 years of maintaining my weight, the team agreed for me to receive the life-saving treatment of bariatric surgery. The mental health aspect of living with obesity for me has been the most challenging. I've received 18 months cognitive behavioural therapy, which I believe is a huge part of how I am still alive today. Bariatric surgery is a treatment for my body. CBT is a treatment for my brain. I spent 30 years of my adult life questioning myself. Why could I not lose weight? Why am I such a failure? At my lowest point, it became so bad, I found myself with a bottle of vodka and a large amount of paracetamol. To this day, I don't know what stopped me from taking them. The hardest part of living with obesity is people's judgment. At 24 stone, nobody seen Angela. They just seen fat and felt they had the right to judge. I'm seen differently now, but I'm still the same person. For example, at a recent weight management clinic checkup, I was sent for an annual blood test. The nurse taking the bloods apologised for keeping me waiting and continued to say, and I quote, "The fat clinic are in today and they take up so much time. It's so much harder to get blood out of them." The nurse had not realised I was attending the fat club because she seen me as a normal weight. Since maintaining my weight, I've witnessed so many examples of weight stigma and bias simply because people don't know my history. It's heartbreaking. Volunteering as an obesity patient advocate, I have been educated to the complexities of obesity and the scientific evidence that proves up to 70% of a person's weight is determined by their genetics, just like the colour of our eyes, the colour of our hair, the size of our feet. I need more than eat less, move more. I need the intervention of bariatric surgery as a treatment. I needed psychological support to unravel the damage years of stigma and bias had done to me. If my general practitioner had not seen me as Angela, I truly believe I would not be alive today. This is why I share my experience in the hope that together we can make a change and help support people living with obesity. We need to change the narrative. We need to listen to the scientific evidence, and we need to stop weight stigma and bias. Today, I hope I have assisted you to see obesity from a different perspective. As humans, we all need to take responsibility for our health. I truly do believe to eat healthy and be more active will help everyone to live a happy and healthier life, no matter what body we live in. We are all individuals with different struggles, and what works for one person may not achieve the same result for others. So today I would like to ask you, the next time you see a person living with obesity, please see the person. Thank you.
Well, I think thank you, actually, Angela. Thank you so much for that incredible testimony. And I think that has really set the tone for the rest of what we're going to hear and discuss today. So huge thanks for your input today. And we're now going to turn to Dr. Stuart Flint. Stuart is Associate Professor of Psychology of Obesity at the University of Leeds. So Stuart's going to present on weight stigma, why system-wide change is needed. So Stuart, over to you.
Thanks. I'm just
Are you able to share your screen, Stuart?
yeah, just looking to the share button. It's not where it usually is. Have I got the have I got an option to share?
Yes, yeah, you can control and share the screen. Yeah. So it should be down in the center of the bottom of your screen. Yeah.
Apologies, I've got it. Okay, great. Can you see my screen?
That's great, thanks.
Lovely, thank you. And Thanks very much to Food Active for inviting me. And what a great testimony there from Angela. I think it sets the tone very well, and probably gives me a bit of an easier job in terms of describing the importance of weight stigma, because I think Angela has really captured that as part of her talk. As the introduction says, I'm Stuart Flint and I'm an associate professor at the University of Leeds. And this has been a key topic for me for the last 15 years or so. And what I would say, and a lot of people, when I was talking with Food Active in developing this talk, and of course, yet another call to action, but it's a call to action that I think is gathering pace. And the popularity of this event really shows how much I think we've moved on, and the amount of mileage we've made over the last decade in particular. Certainly around about 2009-10, my first ventures into Parliament to talk about this topic, it really wasn't at the top table. It really wasn't on the agenda. But now it certainly is. Since around about 2016-17, there has been a wealth of research and engagement from lots of different organizations. And I think we're moving to a point now where we can keep talking about weight stigma, but I think we really need to be moving this to actions as well, because we're really showing how much of a social injustice topic this is that requires change. So for me in this presentation, what I really want to highlight is that change is needed, and change is needed right across the system. I'll start by firstly saying that, of course, weight stigma bias, it's learnt. It's, of course, not something that we're born with. It's something that we develop. And of course, as very young individuals, as babies, as infants, we don't have biases. We're learning biases, and we're learning stigma from information that we receive from around us. Of course, from a very early age, whether it's a child's engagement with their parents or significant others, they're learning about biases. And of course, some biases may be positive, and of course, some biases may be quite negative. And on the left here, the great man himself, Nelson Mandela, I like to use this quote. And he's really saying here that, of course, nobody is born hating another person because of their appearance. And so this quote could very easily be about weight and weight status or appearance. But that's what we have in today's society, in the UK society, but of course around the world. We're seeing research evidence, and we're seeing a lot of anecdotal evidence that people experience weight stigma right across society, and it's impacting people in many different ways, which I'll come on to later in the presentation. So what is weight stigma? And weight stigma is quite a wide concept. And for those of you who've engaged with literature or had some training or education, you'll know that there's a lot of different concepts that are covered within weight stigma, but typically what we're referring to is negative attitudes and beliefs about people purely based on their weight status or appearance. Why is this important? Well, we know that stigmatizing attitudes predict discriminatory behavior. We've known that for some time. Research has shown that this is linked, that there's a predictive element here. And what we also know is that weight stigma or bias can be captured on both a conscious and unconscious level. So as alluded to by Angela in her talk just there, people may actually be behaving in a stigmatizing or discriminatory fashion without knowing about it, unintentionally. That doesn't make it right, but there are different levels here that we're talking to. So there is blatant stigma, and weight stigma, of course, is a little bit different in terms of other stigmas that we know are evident in our society, because weight stigma in many instances is actually encouraged or promoted. And in some instances, we might see that in the media, and that's an obvious vehicle where we see encouragement of weight stigma at times, rather than other forms of stigma. But what we do know is that it predicts discriminatory behavior, and unconscious bias that is captured, we know is a stronger predictor compared to conscious bias. So we do need to be aware of unconscious biases and their role here. What I'll also quickly say is that throughout my presentation, you'll know that I'll talk to stigma, bias, and discrimination. There's lots of different terms that are used. I use stigma, bias, and discrimination because of the cognitive, or typically cognitive or attitudinal elements of stigma, bias and discrimination, which may be both attitudinal but also behavioral. But in particular, I move away from other terms that are used, and you may have seen them, particularly again in the media. So shaming, for instance, so maybe fat shaming, but shaming in particular, I move away from, because I believe that actually what we're talking about when we're thinking about stigma and discrimination reflects a lot of the elements of, in this instance, in the UK, legislative guidelines around discrimination. So we think about what weight stigma is. It's direct discrimination, it's indirect discrimination, it's bullying, it's harassment, it's victimization. This is really what we're capturing here. And I think by moving away from terms such as discrimination itself and using shaming, I think it moves us away from actually the importance of what we're talking about, and again may reduce the need to, or at least the perceived need to, address weight stigma across our society. So again, Angela talked to this. There's lots of different stereotypes and perceptions that we have in our society. This is by no means a holistic list of stereotypes and messages that we have about, in particular, people of a higher weight status and the overweight and obesity ranges. And you'll recognize a lot of these. And you'll recognize a lot of these not because you're using them or because you're thinking these, but because ultimately we've been exposed to these types of stereotypes and stigmas for a long time. We've been exposed to these from very early age. So in children's media, these types of these stereotypes are very evident. So from an early age, we are exposed to information that suggests that people who are overweight or living with obesity are slow, are lazy, are gluttonous. That's the first types of stereotypes we often see in media, for instance. And as children age, they start to see stereotypes and are exposed to stereotypes such as lacking friendship, being unintelligent. And then into adolescence, of course, it's age related in terms of the exposure to these stereotypes. It may be being unattractive. These are the stereotypes that we see. I've highlighted a few in blue because I think they're important and pertinent to this conversation. So abnormal, perceiving that people are abnormal and ultimately in an out group compared to this in group. And again, it divides society. A burden, and you all would have seen burden. Burden is a term that's used throughout media, but is also used in policy and in campaigns and other. We're talking about the burden of obesity. But what I would say is that how many days in a row could you experience, and what would be your response to being referred to as a burden on society? And actually, when we talk to people living with obesity who are experiencing stigma, often these are the types of terms that are internalized, and they feel that they're a burden. And this feeling can also impact their engagement in society, whether it's in workplaces or other, but also in healthcare. And so burden is a really detrimental term that's used in this space. And of course, failure, and actually Angela used the word failure. So this perception that an individual is a failure purely based on somebody's weight status. And of course, as Angela again alluded to, the reasons that people may have different weight statuses are because of many, many different factors, many factors that are wholly or even partially out of an individual's control. But we have this rhetoric that ultimately says that we can assign blame, but also perceptions of success or failure to people based purely on their weight status or appearance. And what I also want to say is that these messages are ingrained. These messages are pervasive in our society. They've been around for a long time. So it's not that we've suddenly been receiving information over the last 5 years or so about weight stigma or that's reinforced weight stigma, but it's been for a long time. This is an example of a poster which was part of a campaign from the Health Education Council in the 70s. But again, you can see here the stereotype that's very evident here around attractiveness, but also this focus, this simplistic focus around food and exercise as that final common pathway that we know is associated, is what impacts people's weight status. But of course, that's very simplistic when we know that there's many, many other factors, over 100 different factors that actually contribute to somebody's weight status and health, of course. So to focus in and to simplify what is a very complex health condition is extremely stigmatizing and can impact people's perceptions of somebody's ability potentially to change their weight status too. And of course, this leads to different actions. Some of you will remember this from 2015. It was around about now, it was November 2015, where a group took it upon themselves to refer to themselves as Overweight Haters Limited. And that group ultimately went to the London Underground and they started giving out these business cards. These were the business cards. But again, in this, you can really see the stereotyping, the active dehumanization of individuals within the rhetoric that's used here. So our organization hates and resents fat people. We object to the enormous amounts of food resources you consume while half of the world starves. We disapprove of your wasting NHS money to treat your selfish greed. And we do not understand why you fail to grasp that by eating less, you'll be better off, slimmer, happy, and find a partner who is not a perverted chubby lover, or even find a partner at all. We also object that the beautiful pig is used as an insult. You are not a pig, you're a fat, ugly human. And so this might sound like quite an extreme example, and it may well be in terms of a group taking upon themselves to go to the underground and give these out to people at random who maybe finish work and are returning home, and suddenly a stranger walks up to them and gives them this card. But this rhetoric is not extreme. This rhetoric is the rhetoric that people are seeing and experiencing every single day. But actually, because weight stigma has become so normalized, often we're not even picking this up. We're not even recognizing that we're experiencing and being exposed to weight stigma every single day. So what ultimately happens is, because we're developing these different types of biases, is that there's ultimately a schism between what is objective facts or evidence and what we have as our beliefs. And these two circles here ultimately may converge at times, and they may become more disparate. But ultimately, we're working with information that we might see as facts. And of course, we take information from different sources that we see as fact, and what we see as our beliefs. And when it doesn't fall with our beliefs, we ultimately are in this, we're experiencing some form of dissonance as such, where our perception doesn't match our reality. And we need to ultimately address that. And we address that in some instances, particularly in relation to weight stigma. And again, because continuously and consistently we're exposed to stigma, it may lead us to addressing or thinking about actions or activities that occur in our society from a stigmatizing perspective. And here's one, for instance, and some of you will recall this. These were some mannequins that were created by Nike, which they're described as being plus-size mannequins that were wearing some of their clothing. And what we actually had was a lot of rhetoric where people were unhappy that there were more diverse ranges, body ranges, mannequin sizes that were being used, and were being used and associated with physical activity. And because of, for instance, perceptions or stereotypes that people with a higher weight status are inactive, they're lazy, etc. This stereotype that's been around for a long time, it doesn't fit with our prior bias. But actually now I'm unhappy about some of these things that actually should be celebrated. It should be celebrated because actually it's being more inclusive, and we're supposed to be moving towards a more inclusive environment and society. Now, I'm not going to spend too long on this because I'm followed by some great speakers who will talk more specifically to some of these areas. But the main point I want to make here is that, as I've said, weight stigma is ingrained, but it's pervasive right across society. And again, we don't know it. A lot of this is unconscious, but we're experiencing weight stigma almost daily. In education, we know stigma is very evident. Children are reporting stigma from fellow classmates, from instructors, from teachers. We know that weight-related teasing and bullying is the most common form of bullying and teasing now. So more children are reporting that form of bullying compared to others. In workplaces, we know that people are overlooked for jobs in the recruitment and promotion rounds. Work in the US has shown that people living with obesity are paid less compared to people within the healthy weight range, even though they're performing exactly the same job, maybe expected to work longer hours. are perceived as having less leadership qualities, again, purely based on their weight status or appearance. In the media, both traditional and new media, and I think we really need to be capturing more information on new media, because that's actually where people are going nowadays, to social media and other for their news information. We know that stigma is playing out. So we know that stigma is very evident in the media, and the media is so wide-ranging and available that it clearly is an important vehicle. And for many people, media, of course, is the source that raises their awareness and educates people about health topics, about policies, and about many different things. Actually, the media is key. Exercise and physical activity settings, again, an environment where we know stigma plays out, from personal trainers and exercise instructors. In healthcare, where healthcare providers, we know that healthcare providers are not immune to weight stigma attitudes. We know this impacts the consultations they have, not just in terms of the language and communication that's used, but we also know that impacts their perception of the time they spend talking about healthy behaviors, about weight management. We know that it impacts the likelihood of signposting and referral to different types of services and we know ultimately this impacts a person's likelihood of engaging with healthcare, not just at the time, but also in the future. And of course, in policies and campaigns, and the framing of policies and campaigns has for a long time reinforced this, as I mentioned, this very stereotypical and stigmatizing simplistic view of weight and weight status. But also what we've seen throughout that is a focus on blaming the individual. And that frustrates me, and it's frustrated me for some time, particularly in the UK, where we had what was a really important piece published in 2007 called the Foresight Report. I don't have time to talk about that in detail, but ultimately it showed the complexity of weight gain and obesity, the many different determinants that may influence a person's weight status, and therefore the many different factors that can contribute, which are multi-level or multidisciplinary, really showed the complexity. But since then, since 2007, actually what we've received is a much more simplified view that doesn't align to the evidence that was actually created, which was a government-led piece. It's become much more individualized, and we've ultimately moved to a point where individuals are, it's being framed as much more of an individual problem than the reality. The reality is that right across society, there's different factors that are contributing to people's weight status and overall health. This was quite a nice report that was published by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Obesity. This is, again, not a holistic overview of all the findings, but I pulled out 3 of the key findings that I think are important. On the left, they ultimately created a survey, collected data. So on the left, 88% of people living with obesity had reported being stigmatized, criticized, or abused as a direct result of the weight status. That's probably not as much of a surprise. The second 2, I think, are a surprise, but also quite alarming from my perspective. 26% of people living with obesity reported being treated with dignity or respect by healthcare professionals when seeking advice or treatment relating to their obesity. So only 26%, only 1 in 4. And what I would always say is that if I was going to healthcare, and I hope that everybody else on this workshop would feel the same, I would expect to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter what. So the fact that only 26% of people living with obesity reporting being treated with dignity and respect, I think is shocking. And it's something that we need to really have a look at in healthcare. 42% of people living with obesity did not feel comfortable talking to their GP about their obesity or their weight. So again, I think a shocking statistic. And I think that ultimately what we want is a perception that we can talk openly in a safe environment with a healthcare professional, with a trusted healthcare professional. And unfortunately in the healthcare space, and I think Sadiq might talk a bit more to this, ultimately, when we see weight stigma in healthcare, it starts to impact the trust and the bond that people have with their practitioners. The patient-practitioner relationship is impacted by experiences of weight stigma. So language, of course, is a key space. I think language is something that we can, in the short term, look to change on many different levels. And maybe there's many different people on this workshop, a webinar, that could make some changes in the short term about language and framing that possibly is being used in different types of work or initiatives or interventions or maybe policy, if there's policymakers on the call. And what we ultimately have seen is that there's really stigmatizing language that's being used in many different spaces. And this was something that I picked up quite recently, so just in October. And what we have seen is really alarmist language that's being used throughout COVID, just to pick that up. So there's been a lot more rhetoric because of the association that's been talked to in the media and elsewhere, that people living with obesity are at this increased risk relating to COVID. And so a lot of the talk has been very much about, in particular, if we did an analysis of the frequency of the words relating to death in particular and mortality, there's been really alarmist language that's being used in media and other. But language has been detrimental, it has been stigmatizing for such a long time, and we haven't really addressed the stigmatizing language that we know has been evident for that time period. So on the left is a news article from 1967 that's using quite stigmatizing rhetoric and using the term fatties that we know is a very negative term. But again, in 2018, the same term is being used in the media. So we're not really learning from the evidence base that's showing us that certain types of language and terms are not appropriate to being used. And we see that in media. So on the left, and many of you will have seen the TV program, which became a bit of a global sensation, I guess, to some aspect, but it was certainly played out across the globe. The Biggest Loser, from the very title itself, it's reinforcing a certain perception of people with a higher weight status, people with overweight and obesity. What we do know from the literature, and there's been a lot of literature between 2012 to 2016, looking at exposure to this program, that people become much more concerned about their appearance and weight. There is an increased dislike for people living with obesity, that there was a greater belief that weight is controllable, i.e. that people could change their weight status within their own means and relatively easily. But importantly, we also saw, or research also reported, that there was a lower motivation to engage in health-related behaviors such as exercise. So actually, it was very detrimental to people who are watching and exposed to this type of media. And then on the right, and this is quite recent, 2017, I believe, or 17 or 18, we've seen quite a lot of literature that's ultimately, media that's ultimately suggesting that people with different health conditions or different needs from the NHS should be prioritized. But I am really focused here on this word feckless patients. And if we look at the dictionary definition of feckless, it's the Cambridge Dictionary suggests that it's weak in character, lacking determination. And so there's some quite important rhetoric that's being used that, again, consciously and unconsciously is impacting our perception of people with a higher weight status.
Just one more minute, thanks, Stuart.
Okay, all right. Time bit there. What I'm going to do is skip through these next couple of slides relatively quickly. Here was really just to show that unintentionally in policy, we do have different frames for the way that we describe different health conditions. We've picked this up because I think this is an important one. It's not to say that obesity and cancer are the same thing by any means. I think they're very different. But what I am saying here is that we, our approach now and the way that ultimately people are experience healthcare and are supported should be the same. The same amount of respect should be delivered for both people with obesity or cancer or any other health condition, for instance. But actually what we see in the rhetoric used in the framing of policy is very different. So on the left, you'll see differences for cancer and obesity. So cancer discussed very positively, reflecting hope and optimism. People living with cancer discussed as survivors, being part of a cancer family, and so on. So really positive. And ultimately what this is reflecting is optimism and hope. And I think that's really what we would want from healthcare. We went to healthcare ourselves and we spoke with healthcare professionals or other, is optimism and hope. Why is that important? We know that's more likely to lead to effective effective supports, but in particular encouraging healthy behaviors and other. The narrative for obesity is one that reflects pessimism and fear and unpleasantness. So oppositely actually leads to frustration, despair, and anxiety. So the burden of obesity, describing obesity as a problem, discussing obesity alongside behaviors rather than outcomes, I think is also quite detrimental. And if you look at different types of websites, NHS Digital on the left, and in Wales, Health in Wales, what we typically see is that obesity is grouped with behaviors and not with outcomes. That again reinforces the perception that obesity or weight status can be changed easily and rapidly. Obesity or weight status itself is not an outcome. It's not an outcome. It's not a behavior. It's not a behavior like physical activity or smoking or other. It's an outcome. It should be on the left. It should be with cancer or diabetes or other. So the consequences are wide-ranging. Again, I won't spend too long on this because I ain't got much time. So there is a common notion in society that weight stigma is beneficial. You will have seen that many times. The media will suggest that weight stigma is beneficial. It really isn't. What we actually know from the literature, and there is masses of literature now that show us that when people experience weight stigma, people with a higher weight experience weight stigma, it leads to detrimental impacts on mental health, on physical health. It can lead to maladaptive behavioral responses, including eating disordered behavior, poorer body image. It can reduce people's likelihood to engage with healthcare professionals. So ultimately, this leads to internalization, disempowerment, reinforces stigma. In some instances, it can lead to weight gain. So this really questions and impacts the effectiveness of what we're trying to do in society. And what I'll also say is that weight bias internalization itself can, of course, then lead to further decrements in terms of mental health, physical health, and behavioral responses. I'll skip to the last slide then, Matthew, if that's all right. So the last slide that I was going to just quickly talk to was that what I really think is that we need change right across society if we're really going to address weight stigma, because it is so pervasive and it's very evident across many different levels. So this isn't a holistic list, but what we really need is actions at a policy level that remove blame and simplistic messaging, in particular, addressing wider determinants and health inequalities that we've talked about for a long time, but actually we've seen very little action. We need to create weight-inclusive settings from the media, but also from others who are disseminating information. We want fair, accurate, and respectful portrayal. We need to include weight stigma and anti-bullying policies, whether that's in the workplace, whether that's in schools or other. We need to focus on equality, diversity, inclusive training, but also promoting a narrative that is much more inclusive and addresses some of the unequal experiences that people have in terms of accessing different settings and so on. But on an individual level, we need to think about our own biases. And I think that we can't move away from that. We need to be prepared to look at our own biases that we may well have also taken on and internalized and maybe impacting our behavior. So to summarize, I think systematic change is needed, and I think the following speakers will really highlight that in the different settings. We all need to reflect and make changes where that's relevant. What I think has been lost in particular is compassion and empathy towards people when we're talking about weight and weight status. And one thing to really just leave you on here is that weight stigma discrimination itself is a modifiable risk factor. Experiences of weight stigma impact people's health status. So addressing weight stigma on its own can have a beneficial impact. And so just to finally leave with Albus, of course, I actually think a lot more conversation is needed. We have seen more conversation, but more is still needed. And in particular, we need a lot more action. Thanks,
Brilliant.
Matthew.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Stuart. That was a brilliant presentation, an awful lot to get through there. And I think that last point you just made, weight stigma and discrimination is a modifiable risk factor in its own right. That is something to really kind of consider as we move forward. So thanks a lot for that. If you could just stop sharing your screen now,
Sure.
and then we're going to hear some shorter presentations, beginning with Professor Fiona Gillison. Fiona is Professor of Health Psychology at the University of Bath. And Fiona's gonna give a presentation. A really good question. This: how can we reduce the risk of exacerbating stigma through the National Child Measurement Programme? That is a personal question. So yeah, if you could just take your presentation down, Stuart, and stop sharing your screen.
Sure.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And nice to speak to you all today. Hopefully someone will tell me, but I think you can see my screen. I'm a health psychologist, and I first got involved with the National Child Measurement Programme in about 2012, when some public health professionals asked me to see if I could help them write the letter to parents better that tells parents when their child has been found to be overweight or to have obesity. And I've gone through a long set of research studies since then, but really sparked off by the idea that it's not how you word that letter that's really the problem here, although there are better and worse ways of doing that. But really the problem is communicating to parents when a child is found to be overweight. And I've worked with a series of people over this time, some of whom have refused to work in this field because they feel that the National Child Measurement Programme is stigmatising and we shouldn't work with it at all. And other people who think, well, if it's going to happen, let's make sure we do it as well as possible. So I'll just talk through a little bit of this work. The first point is probably to introduce those of you who aren't aware with it of the National Child Measurement Programme is. And it's a national scheme. It runs in slightly differently in other home countries as well, which is designed really as a surveillance tool. So we can work out what is the rate of obesity, of overweight among children in the UK. But it's evolved to be more than that, because when school nurses are carrying out these measurements, they feel an obligation to communicate back to parents if a child is overweight or has obesity. Now, the school nurses are really alive to how sensitive a topic this is. So if you were to read the letter, and there's a template that Public Health England produced, it is worded to be as non-stigmatising as is possible, and this is overseen by a board, and we review this regularly. But I think it's interesting how many children take part. So pre-COVID, it's been a little bit thrown out by COVID, but pre-COVID, 95% of children in reception year and in year 6 were weighed and measured by school nurses each year. So that indicates that before hearing that your child might be overweight or have obesity, parents are either interested to know what their child's weight is, or they're not too worried about the weighing process itself. But there does seem to be a different experience afterwards. So these are some examples of newspaper headlines that have been seen in recent years, which are documenting some parents' dismay at having a letter that is telling them about their child's weight status. It's not all parents who are upset by this. There are some parents who find it helpful, but there is a reasonably large minority of parents who are really upset by the feedback that they get. And if you have a look at these titles, a lot of that focus is on the fact that telling children they're overweight, or telling parents at least that the child is overweight, could trigger eating disorders and reduce well-being in children. And then I think that the interesting one as well is the picture of the person on the front of the metro with her child. You would have to be really upset and really angry to want to put you and your child on the front of a newspaper. But that is the level of emotional response that these letters can be triggering. And so this is the reason why the NCMP has come under fire really for causing distress, for causing harm, and for being part of a stigmatized process. And I think we want to question whether it is, but what is the NCMP doing? Well, I think what it's mainly doing is signaling to people that they are part of a stigmatized group or possess a stigmatized characteristic. And you can argue for a while about whether this is the first time people will be aware of that. And it may well be in many cases. So that emotional response is to being told that you are part of a stigmatized group. I mean, I think Stuart set out brilliantly how pervasive the stigma around obesity is. So people don't need to be told what the negative consequences are of weight to feel that that's something that they don't want to be associated with. But there is also an interesting dynamic, because there is stigma to being an obese or overweight child, or a child with obesity, but there's also stigma to being the parent of a child with obesity. And some of this is around parenting practices and the thought that actually what a parent hears when they're told that their child may have obesity is not information about the child's health, but information about their parenting and how we judge them on not being able to manage their child's weight. So what happens in response to this stigma, and how do we see evidence that this stigma is being triggered, and that this event is triggering an acute sense of stigma in this population? Well, firstly, what you see is people trying to distance themselves from this stigmatized condition or group, which is a natural human response that anybody would do. So you see people trying to discredit the source. So for example, challenging that body mass index, BMI, is a reasonable way of measuring excess body weight, or denying that it's true, comparing their child with other children and saying my child looks healthy. You also see a very emotional reaction. So Stuart talked about unconscious and conscious bias, which really comes in here. So I don't know if some of you may be familiar with thinking fast and slow, or system 1 and system 2 thinking, in that as humans we can respond to things in a very rational way. So we might plan, we might hear that our child is above a healthy weight and think, okay, what are the steps I need to do to try and help them reduce that, which would be a more rational and planned approach. Or we might have a very emotional, instinctive, gut feeling response. And actually what stigma does is it means that we respond in a very emotional and instinctive way to protect ourselves, not in a rational and thinking way. So we're triggering these emotions of fear, of anger, sometimes also of hopelessness, particularly if parents are overweight themselves. And this means that you can rationalize as much as you like as a public health team in talking about what steps might be useful, but actually people aren't in a position to work in a rational way. The emotional responses are uppermost. And also, as we've heard, stigma doesn't motivate people to take positive action. It stimulates avoidance. We want to avoid the people who we think will judge us, which may be health professionals, or the situations where that stigma is more visible, which for body weight is going to be situations where you're physically active, and it undermines people's well-being, which is a problem for trying to motivate any sort of behavior. So these are the responses, and we need to be alive to the fact that the National Child Measurement Programme may not be the only source of information a person receives about their weight. I think we've heard, children are very cruel, so it's unlikely a child with obesity is going to be completely unaware. But it is a particular stimulus where this is going to come out a little bit more strongly. But I would like to just think about this in terms of this systems-wide approach. I don't think the NCMP it's hard to argue it's creating stigma. It is triggering a stigmatized response because it's making it very visible. But we should really be asking, if this is going to carry on, and we arguably need information about obesity levels, what can we do to make this part of the solution to stigma rather than part of the problem? And a lot of what's been done so far, I think, is pretty downstream. So we've been trying to help parents to understand that talking to children positively about weight isn't going to trigger eating disorders. There are constructive ways to do that, and that seems a helpful thing to do, but that's not going to solve the problem. Similarly, trying to talk to people about how BMI could be a useful way of working out whether a child has a healthy weight or not, again, is very rational. It's not going to solve the problem that is triggered by stimulating this feeling of stigma. But there are some really positive attributes of the National Child Measurement Programme that I think we could tap into to try and have a positive influence on this systems-wide approach to reducing stigma. And the first thing is that this is an experience that all parents take part in. So it's a universal system in schools. All of the children are weighed or measured. So you don't have to identify as somebody with obesity or with overweight in order to take part. So there's no stigma in having a conversation about the Child Measurement Programme. There's a national infrastructure in place. We don't have to do anything differently now. We have school nurses going into schools every year, all primary schools every year, talking to parents in reception year. Mostly they'll talk to parents at that point, and communicating with parents in year 6. That's already underway. So can we harness that to talk in ways that help to improve people's understanding of the broader influences on weight, and reduce some of that stigma that way? I also think that we have a real resource here in school nurses, because school nurses have been the recipient of parents' anger and distress and real concern about their children following National Child Measurement Programme letters. The ones that I speak to, the people that I speak to, seem to be very advanced in having challenged their own biases and actually making sure they use person-first language and a non-stigmatized approach. We've just been doing some work with Public Health England on guidance for parents about in talking positively to children about weight, and school nurses have been the first to challenge us on each element of that process to make sure that we're not exacerbating this message of it is your fault if you're overweight, and it is your fault as a parent if your child is overweight. So they can be the leaders, if you like, among health professionals. I think they're really well educated to do that and really well placed to do that now. So let's harness them. And it is also a teachable moment within schools. School nurses are going into schools frequently. They are talking with head teachers around the National Child Measurement Programme. They're talking about how schools can have healthy school policies and try and provide healthy food and plenty of physical activity opportunities. They are also well placed to talk to teachers in the first instance about what they can do to reduce stigma about weight. And Stuart mentioned anti-bullying campaigns, which include bullying about body weight. So we have that infrastructure. Maybe we need to start making the conversation about the broad determinants of obesity and the importance of reducing that through the language that we use and through the sorts of things that children are learning, to get into schools, out to parents, and start to have that community-wide discussion that is a lot more positive about body weight. We haven't done that yet, but I think we could. Oh, well, I've saved you some time because I've finished, so I will hand over now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that. And it's a really difficult area, pros and cons, as you have suggested. Well, so we're going to move on now to Professor Sadaf Faruqi. Sadaf is Professor of Metabolism and Medicine at the University of Cambridge. So that's going to talk us through weight stigma in healthcare. So if you want to pop your slides up now, Sadaf, that'd be great.
Great. You can see that okay?
That's super, thanks.
Okay, great. Well, really excited to be talking to all of you today about an issue that I care deeply about. And I think that the time for change with respect to this issue has really emerged. So my focus is really on weight stigma in healthcare, and in particular, the interaction between healthcare professionals and people living with obesity. So I'm based here in Cambridge, where we have an institute where our focus of our research is to try to understand the drivers of obesity and its complications. So when it comes to weight stigma, it's very common, as we've already heard. And when it comes to the experience of interacting with healthcare professionals, if you look at this very large international study across 6 countries, at least 30% of people had experience of weight discrimination, and at least 50% of people had some degree of weight teasing or reported feelings of being teased by their healthcare professionals about their weight. Now, who are the sources of that weight stigma? Well, as you can see here, all colleagues appear to be involved, but particularly doctors. And so this really fits very much with the experience of patients, which is really that this is a persistent scenario happening whenever they engage with healthcare professionals. What is the impact of this weight stigma? Well, as we've already heard, it's quite substantial. These are common prevailing views and attitudes across society, and they appear to be equally prevalent in healthcare professionals. And really, this is despite the fact that for other conditions, we don't see other conditions as being people's fault. And yet these are really some of the key beliefs that people hold when approaching people who are living with obesity. What's the impact of this weight stigma? It's very clear, as we've already heard, that this has a substantial impact on people's lives. I think Angela spoke incredibly clearly about the personal impact, but this is happening to many, many people of all ages. The clear effects of weight stigma on depression, anxiety, and self-esteem. I think what a lot of healthcare professionals fail to recognize, that weight stigma, as well as the effects on the individual's mental health, has a substantial impact on their physical health. So people who experience high degrees of weight stigma are much more likely to gain weight and have difficulty in losing weight over time. They're much more likely to develop obesity-related complications. And if we manage to help people to lose some weight, if they continue to experience weight stigma, it's harder for them to maintain that weight loss. So if you're purely thinking from a health perspective, you would recognize that actually the weight stigma that people experience has a huge impact on their health across the board. Now, this is really flying in the face of the scientific evidence, because a central belief for healthcare professionals who are biased or discriminate towards people with obesity is that actually it's all down to self-control. And if people just had better self-control, they would then just be able to manage their weight and they wouldn't have this problem. And that's really fundamental to blaming people for developing obesity in the first place. And also it's fundamental to the policies that drive the narrative that if people could just take personal responsibility, we wouldn't have the problem with obesity that we have. But this flies in the face of the science. So what does the science teach us? Well, the science teaches us that we have a hormonal system for regulating our weight. And that system is just the same as we have a system for regulating growth, for regulating hormones that affect fertility. We have many different systems in the body, and we have one for regulating weight. Now, the system for regulating weight, to be honest, we've only known about for about 20 years. So it's relatively new in scientific terms. And there will be many senior doctors who didn't learn about this. I didn't learn about this at medical school. It didn't exist. But actually, that's not really an excuse for not knowing about it now. Now, what is that system? Well, that system is really focused on the brain. And the brain is really key to controlling our weight. And for most people who don't have a problem with their weight, they can actually keep a fairly steady weight despite day-to-day changes in how much you eat and how many calories you burn. And that's not down to your excellent self-control. That's actually down to your body's system. And the system, as I mentioned, is controlled by the brain. And the brain receives signals from the body. So it receives signals such as a hormone called leptin, which is made by your fat. Again, up until about 20 years ago, we thought that your fat was just there as insulation, but actually your fat makes hormones which circulate in the bloodstream and go to the brain to tell you about how much nutrient stores you have. And so if people have very little fat or they're starving, for example, then leptin will tell the brain that you need to eat more to restore your weight. Your brain also gets signals from your gut after you eat a meal, telling you that you've eaten and that you're full and that you no longer need to eat. So we have this system for regulating our weight. And the way that we learned about this system was in people in whom the system doesn't work very well. And really the first clues came from genetics. And these were some of our early studies from about 20 years ago now, where we were looking after children who were very heavy. These were some of the newspaper headlines about one of my patients, who was a young child who was at the age of 3, was severely obese. And we found that the cause was a genetic abnormality in the gene that makes either leptin or the leptin receptor in the brain where it works. And these children developed obesity because this gene was faulty. And because we figured out the gene, we were then able to figure out a treatment for this condition. It's relatively rare, but in looking after these children, we learned what happens if the system doesn't have leptin. And if the system doesn't have leptin, or if leptin doesn't work, children become incredibly hungry. They constantly want to eat food. Effectively, they think they're starving, but they're not. But the brain is picking up that signal. Also, any kind of food is incredibly rewarding. They want to crave food the whole time. And they also show a selective preference for high-fat food. Okay. Now, this is important because this taught us about a system that is relevant in everybody. We all have this system. And this system kicks in when you try to lose weight. And so if anybody loses weight, what happens is their leptin levels fall. Okay. That then drives hunger, makes them feel that they may be starving, and they want to eat food more. And actually they prefer high calorie food, food that is very rewarding. We often call it cravings. And then this leads to often overeating, rebound weight gain, and often we call this yo-yo dieting. And this is important because actually for a long time, healthcare professionals have thought that if somebody loses weight, surely they can keep the weight off. And if they don't keep the weight off, that's down to willpower, and actually a lack of willpower on their part. And if they were just told off a bit more, then surely they could fix it. Well, this clearly flies in the face of the science, because that change in weight and the drive to regain weight is biology. And so when people are struggling to lose weight, they're constantly trying to fight against their biology. So I just want to give an example of one particular gene, which I think explains quite widely how many people will struggle with their weight. And so that is a gene that acts in the brain and is triggered by leptin. And that gene is called MC4R, or the melanocortin 4 receptor. And effectively, it works like a switch or a dial, okay? And you dial it up and you dial it down, and that's depending on how hungry or how full you are. And its main job is that when you dial it up to maximum, that happens after you've eaten a meal, and it's the signal to tell you to stop eating. Okay? So it's a really important gene, and it dials up and dials down all the time, every day, in relation to what we eat. Now, what happens is some people have a faulty MC4R gene, and that dial is effectively stuck. Okay? They can't dial it up, they can't activate MC4R, and so they don't feel full after a meal. They tend to be hungry quite a bit, have what we call a large appetite. And in fact, very recent work by our team and our colleagues in Bristol showed that 1 in 300 people in the UK have a change in the MC4R gene that impairs its function and means that the dial is effectively stuck. It might be stuck at 3, it might be stuck at 5. They're highly unlikely to get up to the maximum. And these people are much more likely to struggle with their weight, often from early childhood. And here's a graph showing in hundreds of people, if you follow people where you happen to know that they have the faulty gene, really from early childhood, their weight starts to track above others who have a normal gene. And by adulthood, they're often overweight or obese. Now, what's interesting is that 6 in 300 people have a change in the MC4R gene that improves its function. Their dial is effectively permanently set at 8 or 9. So they're hardly ever hungry. They effectively feel like the MC4R gene is switched on all the time. They're full. They're not hungry. They don't want to eat. They actually are protected from obesity and indeed from diabetes. And so variation in this gene across the population influences significant numbers of people in terms of either their risk of obesity or their protection from obesity. Now, this really adds to a growing body of knowledge which shows that our genes strongly influence our weight. Weight is very similar in identical twins. The weight of adopted children is very similar to their biological parents rather than their adoptive parents. And our genes influence our weight right across the spectrum. Now, in some people, our genes have a strong effect. And if they're not working, like in the children I mentioned earlier, you can cause severe obesity. In many people, I would say the majority of people, you have a combination of genes that when added up together, increase a person's risk of obesity. Now, there are other people who actually can be protected against obesity, like I've just shown here. And in fact, there are even other people who can eat what they like and they never gain weight. They're particularly thin, they tend to think they're morally superior, but actually the genetic science shows they have genes that are keeping them thin. They have less of the genes for obesity and extra genes which keep them thin. So if we know all of this science, why are we not using this science to tackle bias and stigma? And I think that's exactly what we need to do now, because we need something systematic to address the bias in the healthcare professions. So how can we do that? Well, we need to engage people with better training and education to recognize that obesity is complex and it arises from the interaction of social factors, the environment, and our genes. All of these things are involved. If you have a strong genetic tendency and you eat a certain type of food, or you perhaps are a little bit less active, you will gain much more weight than the next person who has a better profile from a genetic perspective. Our genes affect our biology and our behavior. They affect our appetite. How much you eat and what you eat is not down to voluntary control. It's strongly influenced by our biology. There is, of course, a voluntary element too, but it's the two things working together. We should recognize that severe obesity is strongly driven by genetic factors. People with severe obesity have the highest disease burden and, of course, face the most stigma. And weight loss can improve their health, and effective weight loss treatments exist. It's actually the bias amongst us professionally and I think at societal level that's preventing us getting access to treatments for more people. And as a society and in terms of policy, we have to shift the conversation. We will not make headway unless we move away from blaming people for their obesity and move towards supporting people to improve their health and get them the treatments they need if they have severe obesity. You might think this is perhaps a huge task and one that we may not be able to achieve, but I think we've all seen in the last 10 years or so a change in societal attitudes towards mental health. And I think we face a similar battle here, because ultimately we have to reduce bias amongst healthcare professionals, because fundamental to the care of people is the trust between their healthcare professionals and the patient. And that's something that I think collectively we need to address. Thank you.
Sadaf, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. Really, really interesting to know a bit more about this MC4R gene, and absolutely right, the need to shift that conversation. And I suppose embedding this now within medical schools in terms of their training. So thank you so much for that. We're going to move on quickly to Dr. Ollie Williams. Ollie is a THIS Institute Research Fellow at King's College in London. And Ollie's going to present on feeling the weight of expectation, how obesity stigma gets under the skin. So Ollie, over to you. Thanks.
Hi, thanks. Hopefully you should all be able to see my screen now. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to speak today. It's great to be part of a conference with speakers drawing on such a diversity of perspectives and experiences. And so it makes sense to start by telling you a bit about me and my research, so you know where I'm coming from. I'm a sociologist who researches the relationships between body weight, inequality, and health. My research spans the macro-micro scale by analysing how government policies and social circumstances impact individual health and well-being. In particular, I focus on how and why inequalities in health exist, and what are the most effective ways or interventions that we can use to reduce them. In part, I suspect I was invited to contribute today because I created an evidence-based comic with the award-winning illustrator Jade Sarson called The Weight of Expectation. And the comic tells the story of how stigma associated with body weight and size gets under the skin and is felt in the flesh. This came about because, as well as being a researcher, I co-founded an art collective called AWL, and we work collaboratively with artists and designers to make evidence relating to social justice issues like weight stigma accessible and engaging for as wide an audience as possible. The Weight of Expectation is one example of our work and is now being used in health education programs and health services around the world to combat weight stigma. And I'm hoping some of you today will see the relevance of the comic to your own work and would perhaps be willing to put it to good use. So I only have a short time with you today, so I'll give you a brief summary of the research that informed the comic and how this relates to the work of food activists. The comic is based on a year I spent with 3 weight loss groups that met in one of the most deprived neighbourhoods in England. The groups were all single sex, so 2 for women and 1 for men. And they met at a leisure centre once a week for an hour and a half. Every week, each group member would be weighed and have their weight recorded. They would then spend an hour being physically active. As you're probably aware, we live in one of the most unequal countries in the world, and people who live in less affluent areas experience worse health outcomes in comparison to those who live in more affluent areas. Additionally, less affluent areas tend to have higher incidence of obesity, and consequently, their residents are disproportionately disadvantaged by the effects of both inequality and high BMIs. So I was particularly interested in finding out about the group, how the group members negotiated this. And I learned a lot from the time I spent with this group, or these groups. It was clear that the group members were, all of them were forced to negotiate weight stigma in their everyday lives, and that being stigmatized actually made it more difficult for them to lose weight. This is what pretty much all of the research on weight stigma shows. Not only does stigma not promote weight loss, but it actually promotes weight gain. For instance, through comfort eating and exercise avoidance. It's always seemed particularly cruel and counterproductive to me that in our culture, bigger bodies are stigmatized, but in public health, we often promote swimming as one of the best ways for people to lose weight because it's non-weight bearing. However, in almost all instances, it also necessitates getting half naked in a public place where there will be people who can and do look upon bigger bodies unkindly and in many instances are abusive. In fact, it's this page from the comic, which you can see on the slide here, that has been the one that most people have identified with and wanted to talk to me about. So many people of all shapes and sizes have come up to me and said, that's me, I felt that. This is one of the many reasons why people can find it hard to be more physically active. My research shows that it's absolutely imperative that those seeking to promote health through lifestyle modification need to take the influence and effects of weight stigma seriously. So the part of my research that I want to focus on with you today is not on what weight stigma made people do or not do, rather how it got under the skin. So what do I mean by the weight of expectation? Because obesity is commonly framed as a personal failing that places an unnecessary financial burden on national health care systems, the behaviours associated with weight gain are moralised. People don't just talk about eating healthy and unhealthy food or being active or inactive. People talk about being good and bad. What I found working with weight loss groups was that the stigma attached to these so-called bad behaviours gets under the skin and is felt in the flesh. So let me explain what I mean. What I commonly saw when I was doing my research was people would come in and they would say, oh, I know I've put on weight this week. I can feel it. I feel fatter. My clothes feel tighter. I feel gross. I feel big. And then they would list a bunch of the so-called bad behaviours that they had engaged this week. Maybe they had eaten cake. Maybe they hadn't gone for the jog that they thought they were going to do. Maybe they didn't go swimming. And then they would get on the scales. And then they would find out that they had either lost weight or their weight had stayed the same. Now, this didn't always happen, but to everyone, but it happens every week to somebody, and often multiple times. And these people would be shocked and relieved often when they saw what the scale said. And they would say things like, but I could feel it. I could see my belly was bigger. I could feel that I was bigger. And they say, I can't understand how this has happened. Now, this is what I am calling the weight of expectations. It's if group members engaged in these so-called bad behaviours, they would come to internalise the stigma associated with them, to feel a sense of guilt that manifests itself as a feeling in their body. Even though they had not put on weight, they felt the gravity of their actions. They expected their bad behaviours, or so-called bad behaviours, to lead to weight gain, and this expectation made them feel heavier, even if they hadn't put on weight. Hence why I describe the feeling as the weight of expectation. This might seem far-fetched to you because we tend to think about mind and body as being separate. However, most of you already believe in the theory behind this. Think about the classic example of the person working in a high-pressure job being at a higher risk of having a heart attack. Most of you would accept that logic. It's the same process. Think about something like embarrassment. Embarrassment is an entirely socially constructed feeling. What embarrasses me or you that wouldn't necessarily embarrass somebody else. But it's another example of how the social gets under the skin. Think about it. When you get embarrassed, you have a physical reaction to it, blushing, sweating, feeling tighter. All of these things are a physical reaction to a social process. Just like these examples, the weight of expectation is a type of psychosomatic stress, that is stress related to mind and body. It's a reaction to weight stigma and what researchers would term a biopsychosocial phenomenon. This sounds complicated, but really it's something that most of us know to be true, even if only from personal experience. So a biopsychosocial phenomenon is something that is the result of many different interconnected factors. It has biological, psychological, and social elements which culminate in an effect. Thinking about health in these terms helps us to get away from simplistic ideas of personal choice and responsibility. What was clear in the weight loss groups that I observed was that the weight of expectation made people's bodies less knowable to them and was emotionally draining. This didn't promote health. Instead, being stigmatized just gave group members one more thing to worry about and deal with, and made weight loss far more unpredictable and challenging. Something else that was interesting in the weight loss groups was how group members would use physical activity as a way to combat this stigma and the uncertainty it created. Physical activity is moralized as a good behavior, but just being active wasn't enough to make people in this group feel good, which is different to what most studies would show, where people say that they feel good for being physically active. In these groups, the members would talk about needing to get a sweat on, or needing to feel that it hurt the next day, that feel the ache in their body. And so they would often talk about, I want to know that I've done something. So they needed this physical evidence to feel good about themselves. My interpretation of this was that it was to deal with the unpredictability of weight management and to help them negotiate their stigmatized physical form. The sweat and aching muscles provided evidence for themselves and others of the effort that people who are seen to be overweight or obese are assumed to have shared. So physical activity often fell into the shadow of weight loss. And it made me wonder, or makes me wonder, how much more positive and enjoyable might the experience of physical activity be if it wasn't primarily engaged with as a way to lose weight and negotiate weight stigma? Which brings me to the work of Food Active. It's clear from Food Active's core aim that obesity is not only, it is not being addressed as an individual issue, but rather a complex biopsychosocial issue with a multitude of causes. This is brilliant. And the focus on health inequalities in Food Active's campaigns and interventions, with the accompanying appreciation for the need to offer targeted support to particular people and populations, is much needed and, again, brilliant. But the specific focus on a healthy weight seems at odds with the ambition of stamping out weight stigma and promoting health. This is because the roots of weight stigma go beyond just the assumptions that weight gain is the result of laziness and ignorance. They start with the assumption that it is possible to determine somebody's health from their weight. This is because that is, the assumption that there are healthy and unhealthy weights. Rather, weight and BMI are both very crude indicators of health, and good health can and is experienced throughout the weight spectrum. This is why the specific focus on healthy weight seems not to be in compliance with Food Active's own weight stigma checklist, because the notion of a healthy weight is a generalization that will commonly be inaccurate, unhelpful, and harmful at an individual level. Instead of focusing on weight, shifting the focus to engagement in healthy behaviors and acting on the inequalities that disproportionately inhibit some sectors of societies from engaging in them would be a way of directly address weight stigma and promote health. And it would be great to have some discussion of this here today. Thank you. Before I lose my voice, I'll leave you there.
Thanks very much. Cheers. Thanks, Ollie. So if you could just take your slides now, we're going to move on quite quickly to actually a pre-recorded presentation. It's from Professor Paul Baker. Paul is in the Department of Linguistics and English Language at Lancaster University. Paul's pre-recorded a presentation entitled Obesity in the News.
Talk, I want to focus on how the British press write about the subject of obesity, with particular focus on stigmatizing language. This is part of an ESRC funded project at the Corpus Approaches to Social Science Research Centre at Lancaster University. And I'm basing this talk on chapter 5 of a book called Obesity in the News, which is published with Cambridge University Press and should be available next year. We use an online database called Nexus to collect news articles from 11 British national newspapers that contain the words obese or obesity over a decade. Now, one point worth mentioning is that there was a steady increase in this topic with 3,248 articles in 2008, and then 5,808 articles in 2017. And in total, we had over 43,000 articles comprising around 36 million words. And we've relied on the help of computer software to direct us to the most common words and phrases in the articles, although then we've had to read the articles to get a sense of how obesity is characterized. We used a number of techniques to identify stigmatizing language, comparing the language of different newspapers to identify keywords, as well as reading samples of articles and identifying words that belong to similar semantic categories. This table shows a range of different word types we identified. Now, we can't say this is completely exhaustive, but we feel it approaches the saturation point of the kind of stigmatizing language around obesity in the press. So there are 7 categories here. The most common are adjectives, which include a range of insulting and more euphemistic terms, which are often used sarcastically. The table also shows insulting words for body parts, nouns that act as identity labels, and a range of different types of verbs, which are used in actions that obese people are described as undertaking. The most common of these insulting words refer to the ways that people consume food or drink. I should notice that the frequencies that we have here only refer to uses of those words that were used insultingly towards obese people, so we didn't count other cases of these words in the corpus. This bar chart shows the cumulative frequencies of all of these words across the 11 newspapers we examined. You can see that some newspapers, like the Morning Star and the Eye, have very low numbers of them. However, the Mail has a very high number of uses, almost 3 times as many as the Mirror, which is the second highest newspaper. But a point to bear in mind here is that the Mail also contained the most articles in our dataset anyway. It has 12,805 articles, whereas the Mirror only has 3,398 articles. And Mail articles tend to be a bit longer than articles in some of the tabloids. So we could interpret this as telling us that the Mail is more interested in writing about obesity than other newspapers. But we should also bear in mind that the Mail is quite a large newspaper, so it probably writes about a lot of other topics quite a lot more than other newspapers too. A different way of comparing the newspapers is to consider proportionally how often they use these stigmatizing words in terms of the number of words they write about obesity overall. So this chart shows occurrences per million words of articles about obesity that contain the stigmatizing words. Now here you can see that the bar for the Mail is much reduced and actually pretty similar to newspapers like the Morning Star, the Times and the Telegraph. Instead, we can see that the Star has the highest proportion of stigmatizing language, followed by the Sun and then the Mirror. So while these newspapers have less to say overall about obesity, when they do write about it, they tend to do it in a much more stigmatizing way. Stigmatizing language is necessarily cruel, and at times the newspapers acknowledge this, referring to it as bullying. And I want to spend a bit of time focusing on some of the strategies that the newspapers therefore employ in order to get away with the cases where they use these kinds of stigmatizing words themselves. And there are 5 strategies. The first is through the use of stigmatizing language in wordplay, through use of devices like alliteration. So for example, of the 125 references to the word porky in the corpus, half of them are followed by another word beginning with the letter P, porky pets, porky pupils, etc. We also find references to chubby children, tubby toddlers, lardy lags, hefty hounds. Wordplay is a common feature of tabloid news. We occasionally do find it in the broadsheets, as with the Times headline there, which refers to plump my ride, a play on the phrase pimp my ride. And there's also alliteration there with the phrase fit for fatties, and then quite a sly use of the term meaty there. And one thing we found is that articles about obesity sometimes insert as many references to obesity as they can, even if they aren't directly referring to obese people, as in this case with the word meaty. So obesity is stylized as something funny, which makes the stigmatization more palatable. It's harder to criticize something if it's couched in terms of being a joke or a form of wordplay. The second legitimation strategy is to use tough love as a way of justifying stigma. Now here the newspapers are more open about acknowledging that these words are problematic. And so this article, also from the Times, contains the word fatty. The argument is here that you have to be cruel to be kind. And the journalist says, pretending obesity is groovy is not being kind to anybody. Let's get back to fatty baiting. They might be upset, but they'll have an extra 10 years to get over it. So the word fatty here is justified because it's for their own good. The third strategy we found, especially in tabloid papers, was stigmatization occurring as part of inspirational slimming narratives. So these are stories usually about members of the public or celebrities who have been overweight or obese when they were younger and they were bullied about it. So in this Mirror article, the word chubby is attributed to a bully rather than the journalist using it themselves. So again, it makes it harder to criticize. Another strategy is in terms of perspectivization. So here in the Mail, an opinion column is written by a journalist who is ruefully recalling how she used to be slim, but has since put weight on. She says, I look at my double chin and bingo wings and I want to weep. So there's a kind of self-stigmatization occurring here. Someone who identifies as obese is writing about how they feel ashamed and disgusted. And it's difficult to complain about such cases because it doesn't look like anyone has been bullied, but at the same time, there's a message being given off telling us how we should feel about overweight people. A final strategy is to imply that shaming is okay because it's aimed at someone who deserves it, not just because they're obese, but because they're criminal or morally reprehensible in some way. So this is another story from the Mirror, taken from an article about a would-be terrorist called Ifran Nasser. Now, early on in this article, not quoted here, Nasser is described as a 23-stone fanatic. And then later on, in the bit I have quoted, there's quite a bit of focus on his weight. We're told about his nickname, Chubbs, and in the quote there, he's described as a decent footballer despite his size, implying that overweight people are unlikely to be good at football. His weight is firmly positioned as being due to his love of food, with the description of him as always going back for seconds, and most interestingly, not seeming bothered about being fat. Now, in the context of a detailed discussion of the behaviour and motivations of a terrorist, or would-be terrorist, it's notable that Irfan is described as not caring about his weight, a trait which is meant to mark him out as unusual and perhaps contributes toward a wider pattern of social deviance. We found similar kinds of articles which focusing on the weight of people like Ian Huntley, Peter Sutcliffe, and the dictator Kim Jong-un, as well as articles which are focused on criminal behaviour linked to people's obesity. So, for example, one article described a woman who went on TV to complain she was too obese to get a job, and then she was caught stealing cakes just hours later. So there's often an association with obesity and deviance more generally then, and we found that obese people were also assigned negative qualities like ugly, disgusting, unhealthy, lazy, miserable, stupid, illiterate, drunk, greedy, and ashamed. So a few take-home points. Collectively, the British press often write about obese people with a sense of disgust and shame, although it is more prevalent in the right-leaning tabloid press, which are aimed more at working-class people who tend to be those who have less resources and time to engage in exercise or to prepare healthier eating options. They could stop judging and blaming people and stop using this kind of stigmatizing language. Now, due to genetics, age, and other biological factors, some people are going to find it harder to maintain a lower body mass index than others. And I think we should try to limit discussion of obesity to context where it's likely to adversely affect someone's health. And it really should be a matter for health experts, a doctor, rather than journalists or columnists. One suggestion is that if the press must write about obesity, they could focus.
Oh dear, we seem to have been cut somewhat short there in terms of Paul's conclusion. So it seems like the tape ran out. But anyway, huge thanks to Paul for that. That was a really interesting insight as well. And in fact, we've actually got somebody from the media as part of our next panel discussion. So I'm actually going to turn over to Sarah LeBrock now, who's going to chair this next session. We're going to have a panel Q&A session with some of the speakers from this morning. We're going to have some additional panelists who will be part of that as well, just to share their experience and perspectives on the opportunities for addressing weight stigma. So, Sarah, thanks for joining us today, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much. So yes, my name is Sarah LeBrock. I am an obesity advocate and somebody that lives with obesity myself. So I'm going to welcome the panelists to this conversation. So if I could ask all our panelists to unmute themselves, please, and turn on their cameras so we can see you, that would be great. So for our panelists today, we have some familiar faces from this morning's presentations, including Angela Chesworth, a passionate patient advocate, Dr. Ollie Williams of King's College London, Professor Fiona Gilson of the University of Bath, and Professor Sadaf Faruqi of the University of Cambridge. Thank you, everyone. And we also have some new faces, so I'd like to warmly welcome to the panel Dr. Eric Robinson of the University of Liverpool and Claire Kendall, the Social Affairs producer. Thank you both for joining us today. We appreciate your expertise and input into this conversation on weight stigma. Thank you especially goes to the attendees today for sending in their questions during registration. We're going to have some really thought-provoking questions during the session, and we'll use it to kind of frame our conversation. But don't forget to tweet during the session using the hashtag #FoodActive2021. So I'm going to kick off with asking a question from Carrie Wardle, who is a public health specialist from Doncaster Council. And this is going to go to you, Sadaf, please, if that's okay. So can we really eliminate weight stigma while still promoting weight loss programs? And doesn't the promotion of weight loss perpetuate weight stigma? So Sadaf, if you'd like to kick us off with your thoughts on this, then that would be great.
So this is a kind of interesting angle. I mean, to be honest, in my experience of looking after people who have struggled for many years with severe obesity, I don't think just raising the issue in itself necessarily causes the stigma. It's how you deal with things. So you can have a really positive conversation with people to look to support them, or you can have a negative conversation. So I think that it's clear that for many people there are health issues related to obesity, and so supporting people with their health, just as we would if their health was affected by asthma or diabetes, I think is clearly justified. It's really about the style, the tone, the support. I think the way Angela, reported the conversation that she had with, for the first time in many years, a helpful GP. So I think, yes, things can adversely affect individuals in terms of stigma, but it's how it's done.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. And I think it's the assumptive approach sometimes as well, is that you assume somebody wants to lose weight. And it's sometimes that's the bit that kind of adds to the stigma, is that you see someone living in a larger body and you assume that they want to lose weight, whereas actually they might not want to. So I think we need to always be mindful of seeing everyone as an individual and asking what they want rather than just pushing something onto them. So I think that's really important. So thank you for that, Sadaf. So the next question we have is from Gary Bickerstaff, who is a public health programme manager at Bolton Council. This question is going to Angela. So why do the panellists think that people who live with excess weight often use weight stigmatising language? They call themselves fat and also blame themselves for their condition. So Angela, a bit of a question for you there, but would you like to add your thoughts as to kind of why people living with obesity may stigmatise themselves?
I believe it's because we just want to fit in. We just want to be normal, whatever normal might be. So, like I said earlier, all that people living with obesity or overweight hear from governments, the media, from healthcare professionals, from family and friends, is stigmatizing language about that they should just eat less and move more and it's their choice. And so the person internalizes what they hear, the language that's used around obesity and overweight, and they use it themselves as a defense mechanism. It's their armor to protect themselves and make fun of themselves before somebody else does, because then they just want to fit in, and so they join in the conversation using the words fat, and all the other things, because that's how much they want to fit in with society around them, even though it hurts.
Yeah, totally agree with you. I think the bit around internalizing that kind of language is really important here, because I think even kind of you and I kind of that understand obesity a lot more now, and I find even having conversation with people that potentially don't understand that obesity is very complex and they're living with obesity themselves, they find it really hard to understand that they shouldn't blame themselves and this isn't their fault. And it's really difficult to have that conversation sometimes. So I think because I don't think we appreciate the power of the societal messaging that is out there and the impact that has on people living with obesity. And I think that's where we need to kind of really start changing that narrative, because it's so impactful. So thank you, Angela. Thank you for your insights on that. So we now have a question from Sabine Appleby, who's a project officer at School Food Matters. And this is for Fiona. So the question is how to eliminate the weight stigma when working in schools with senior leadership to support children's health. So Fiona, I know your research has explored alternative ways of delivering some of the message in the NCMP letters. So would you mind giving your thoughts on this, please?
Sure, and it fits in very well with what Angela, well, you and Angela were just talking about in terms of, I mean, I don't think we can eliminate all stigma in schools because they're part of society, but we can start a really positive process there. And anecdotally, I've seen it where my own nephews challenged their mother about something that she said that was negative about what a person was wearing, and they'd obviously had some education at school that had taught them that this was not how you treat people because of their looks, and it was a really excellent example of what schools can do. So in terms of the question about being senior leadership, the first thing is to convince them that that obesity isn't about eating less and moving more, and to challenge their own biases. So hearing from Angela or someone like Angela would be phenomenally powerful. So I think you'd have to get them as advocates first, and there are other resources out there, including yours, that that you can use. But giving that school leadership and the other teachers a chance to just realize that we are all biased, theirs is the bias, and this is the impact on children, so that they are leading that from the front. And then there are really good education packages to introduce to children, who will then, as I have seen even in my life, take that home, so that you're part of that change, which then needs to spread across society. But I think we can. It's also a really good time to get to parents, some of whom will be overweight or have obesity themselves, because parents do want the best for their children, and actually, particularly at the younger years, so reception age, it's much easier to have this conversation about a child's weight because parents are more used to worrying about the hearing test and the sight test and other indicators of health. So it's perceived to be less judgmental at that point than it would be when you're further on in school. So I think starting early with really open conversations about the challenges of weight, and this will be parents of children of all body weights. All parents are worried about what their kids eat, trying to get them to eat healthily. Are they eating too much, not enough? And all parents are trying to get children off tablets and moving. So again, that's a bit, you can help to destigmatize it by saying this isn't a problem for parents whose children have a high body weight. This is a problem for all parents, in order to give children that healthier start. So in summary, yes, get your senior staff as advocates, but use that school to spin out this message of the complexity of obesity.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting insight, actually, because I have got a 2.5-year-old, and I think for most of her life, you spend time going and getting them weighed, don't you, from when they're a baby. You're focusing on their weight constantly because you're wanting them to put weight on and you're wanting them to get to a certain. So actually, I understand what you're saying there, actually, because focus on that kind of the fact that people are quite conscious of it at the earlier years, but make it a positive experience rather than it being a negative one, and then kind of educate from there. And yeah, that does make sense to me. So yeah, thank you for that insight. That's really interesting. So now moving on to the next question from Barry Akehurst, who's a business and contract support officer at St Helens Council. So this is to Ollie, please come back, Ollie. What are your thoughts on healthy weight challenges in the workplace, where colleagues who choose to participate submit their weekly weight loss and are shown a leaderboard, and the person who loses the most weight wins a prize? So I wondered, Ollie, whether there was anything that came out of your interviews with members of weight loss groups that may shed some light on how such challenges may be creating stigma in the workplace. I think you touched upon this in your presentation a little bit, but just to kind of elaborate on that a bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah and Barry, for that question. Of the 3 weight loss groups that I was like part of for my research, one of them actually did do something very similar to this, where each month they all put money in, and each month the person who lost the most would get like all the money that everyone had put in. And yeah, like you said, Sarah, it relates to what I was saying towards the end of my presentation, where I think the conflation of weight loss and health is particularly problematic at this point. So I should say that, like, I'm not anti-weight loss. People will want to modify their bodies for various different reasons and have different motivations for doing that. And I don't think it makes sense to be anti-weight loss. People have different reasons for wanting to do that. But I think this example is actually a clear example of where the goal of weight loss has become detached from the aim of promoting health, for instance. So the assumption is in this example that all weight loss, and in particular the most weight loss, is a positive thing and worthy of celebrating. It's worth remembering that many of the most effective ways of losing weight are anything but healthy, and they're not promoting health. And this assumption that weight loss is always positive can often promote unhealthy and harmful relationships with food, eating, bodies. So I would say on a practical level, you're probably not promoting health if you're engaging in this sort of strategy. The other level of it is, I think we should expect much more from our workplaces in terms of promoting the health of their staff. We often see, I'm sure we've all been employed in places that tell us that our health is very important to them, and yet then they give us things like desk yoga or competitive weight loss initiatives. So workplaces should be doing far more. So for instance, giving people better pay, more flexible working hours, investing in staff services. So for instance, every place that I've ever worked, they have had a gym, but if I wanted to be a member of that gym, I had to pay. And it's much more common in other countries and in some sectors for, if you really do want the health of your employees to be promoted, you would invest in services that would help them to do that, and you would give them the time and space in order to allow that. And I just want to bring up the example of Japan, for instance, because I think it is interesting. So Japan has some of the lowest instances of obesity, and is one of the least, the levels of inequality are some of the lowest in the world. And they treat the issue of weight very differently. So they don't have obesity in the same way that we have here. They have something which they call metabo, which is a combination of different tests. So it's not just BMI, it's a combination of lots of different things that take on board different factors. So you get a more holistic understanding of health rather than just looking at somebody's height and weight. And in Japan, they have quite a different situation from here, where everybody has to have life insurance. And it's very common for employers to offer life insurance. And what they did as part of a policy to try and promote health was they made it the employer's responsibility that somebody has positive metabo tests, right? So at that point, what it meant was, they made it the responsibility of the life insurance companies. And because those life insurance companies were, in many instances, the employers, what those employers started to do was to create work environments and invest in services that meant that their employees could lead healthier lifestyles. And it's that sort of thing that I think if we want to really promote health and we want there to be a difference, we need to think about doing things differently. And I think in this country at the minute, workplace health initiatives very often are very individualizing and not particularly supportive. So yeah, but again, before I lose my voice, that's how I answer that question.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. I think that's really interesting to get that insight from Japan. I didn't know about that, and actually I'd be really interested to finding out a bit more. But I agree with you, coming from a corporate culture myself, when I look at the well-being stuff that's always been on, it's always been focused around kind of diet and exercise being the main focus around what we need to look at. And we very much need to come away from that and look at it as more of a holistic approach. I totally agree.
And often just telling people to move more and eat well, sleep more, not actually doing anything to help them or support them doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. The support is key as well. So yeah, thank you. So just moving on to the next question, because I'm just conscious of time because we're overrunning slightly. So I'll just move on to the next question. So we've got a presentation coming up after the break from Obesity Health Alliance to explore eliminating weight stigma as part of their healthy weight strategy. However, I just want to ask Eric what his research has found in terms of the impact weight stigma may be having on efforts to address obesity and what the relationship is there. So Eric, could I ask you to come in, please?
Yeah, sure. So I think the research that we and lots of other people have done suggests that if you look at people who feel stigmatized because of their weight, compare them to people who don't. If you look at people who've been discriminated against because of their weight, compare them to people who haven't been, the research is very consistent and clear that stigma and discrimination are associated with much worse health outcomes and with people going on to gain more weight rather than lose weight. So all of that research is really very consistent. And some of the work we're doing at the moment is asking the question, how much of the obesity-related disease burden is caused potentially by stigma? So when we say obesity reduces life expectancy, costs the economy, however many billion, it seems from the research that we're doing that actually part of that isn't because a person is objectively heavier, but because of the psychological consequences of living as a person with obesity. All of that research, the caveat with all of that research is that it's observational. So you follow people over time and see what happens to them. So it's more difficult to infer causality from that. But of course, it wouldn't be ethical to randomize half of a group of people to experience stigma or discriminate against them and see what happens. So we have to work with the data and the evidence that we've got. And then the other thing that I think is interesting to think about is what do narratives around stigma, so around self-control, laziness, personal responsibility, what do they do to our policies in public health? So I think they almost definitely promote public health policies that target personal responsibility. When a society thinks about obesity in that way, then that will be the obvious policy approach to take. But the reality, of course, is that obesity is caused by much wider, bigger environmental influences like social inequality, poverty, and the food that we're being sold and provided by the food industry. So I think there are also potential detrimental effects of stigma in terms of looking forward and trying to change the food environment and make life far easier to eat healthily and not develop obesity.
Yeah, I totally. I think it's really interesting that just hearing kind of your research around this, because I think people don't understand the how much of an impact stigma has, and I think it's around words are so powerful. And I think we really need to remember that when we're talking about obesity, that literally just the way we phrase something or frame something can have such a huge impact in a positive or a negative way. But in some ways, it's kind of quite a simple thing to change. It's just changing how we do that. And it would have such a huge impact on somebody. So thank you. I think that's really important to kind of get that message across. And we're going to follow that up now with talking to Claire. So I'd like to come to Claire, kind of for whom we've got some questions. So we've heard from Professor Paul Baker earlier about language, how language matters, which again follows on from what we're just talking about, especially when it comes to news coverage on obesity. So Claire, obviously you and I know each other, and I know we've had these conversations before. So we're very grateful for you to be here today to discuss this. So we'd like to discuss some of the recent coverage you've had on weight, stigma, and mental health. So as a role, your role as a producer, why did you feel that there was an impetus to run news stories on weight stigma, obesity and mental health in the last 6 months? Kind of what kind of pushed you to do this?
Yeah, it was really interesting actually, because it all really arose through an editor of mine who was asking me originally to look at links with COVID. And from there, I started to do a lot more research into living with obesity, stories around that. And it was really then that it became apparent that this fell completely within my remit, because I specialise on working on stories that are misunderstood or misrepresented, speaking to people who often don't have a voice, or have a voice that isn't usually heard or understood in the right kind of way. And so suddenly I realised, and came at this from a complete novice, that this really was a huge area that needed covering. And I know that there's a lot of language and portrayal within the media towards weight and stigmas around it. And I think that the more I learnt about it, the more I realised I wanted to try and highlight some of those issues and address living with obesity correctly. And I mean, as you know from working with you, Sarah, language was something we took incredibly seriously. And I think that our editors were completely open to the 2 sets of features we've done. So we did the first set of features in June that went out on stigma, and the second lot that went out the other week on mental health. And there was absolutely a complete desire across the board from BBC outlets for this kind of information and this sort of story. I mean, our first story we did about trying to explain and understand a bit more about living with obesity, about causes, about all the things you've probably discussed this morning already. But we turned that into a whole host of things, including something with you, Sarah, that went on Facebook and Instagram. And, we immediately had 750,000 views on both of those sites. I did a long read, which is a sort of, as it says, on the BBC website, a longer written article. And that got the most engagement of any long read that week. And it had 1.5 million readers within the space of a couple of days. So I think that there is somewhere, obviously, a desire for people to find out more, for people to understand more about it. And that's what then led onto us wanting to do the piece on mental health, which was almost like a sort of follow-up piece, really. And it's a really difficult subject. It's really contentious because you have so many different views, not just from those that don't understand and suggest that you just should move more and eat less, but you also have people from different areas, those living with obesity that have very different views on how things should be portrayed. And we just tried our best to be able to put out the stories of people that could explain as clearly as possible to be able to do that. And hopefully we have gone some way to addressing issues like stigma. And we find that doing it through people's stories is the best way. So one thing I didn't want to do is, we're fed up of seeing photos of people with their heads cut off, focusing on their midriff. And, this is what we didn't want. What we wanted was to hear from people who were brave enough to put their story forward. And it's a really, really difficult thing to do within the media for people to do that. And obviously, we were grateful to you, Sarah. In our second pieces, we had India and Tom and Alex who did the same. And, India and Tom put themselves out there on social media as well, which is a massive issue because people don't want to have to put up with the criticism that comes with that, but they both did that and they got so many positive comments. And I mean, afterwards I got from within the areas of the BBC I'd never even heard of, the Ukrainian service, the Turkish service got in touch with me asking if they could have a copy of our piece to run as well. So hopefully this isn't just UK interest, but this then becomes world interest.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. And I think what kind of makes me feel positive is that there are people like you out there in the world of media wanting to get this message across in a positive way, because I think we sometimes talk about the media in a negative way, and it always being about the wrong language or the wrong framing or and so kind of, you know, working with you and seeing kind of what your team are doing and what the BBC are doing generally, I would say across, you know, I've seen it now in various things. It does seem like that's changing, and that people are beginning to understand obesity in a different way and are wanting to kind of put things out in a more positive way. So thank you. You know, I appreciate that. It's not easy when it's kind of something that is very much this society is going against what you're trying to put out there, but it's really important. And so thank you for, you know, for doing what you do. And I hope we continue to see more kind of positive stuff coming from the BBC, because yeah, there's lots more to share. So I think this conversation could go on for a very long time. I could quite happily talk to you all day, to be honest, but time is against us. So I think apologies, we can't get through all the questions submitted by the audience, but there have been some fantastic ones. So thank you to everyone who have submitted one. We're going to take a well-earned break now, just for 5 minutes, please, if possible. Kind of stretch your legs, grab a tea and coffee, have a comfort break, and come back into your seats for 11:45, where we'll be hearing from some fantastic charities, including the Obesity Health Alliance and the World Obesity Federation, as well as some speed presentations to highlight what work is going on locally to eliminate weight stigma. So thank you to all my panel today, and thank you everyone, and see you after the break.
Okay, folks, we're going to make a start again. I hope you've had time for that quick cup of tea. A huge thanks to Sarah LeBrock, for chairing that last panel session, and to all of our speakers this morning. So the second half of the conference, we've got a lineup of speakers that will consider weight stigma within obesity policy and examples of action to help reduce weight stigma. And we're going to turn now to Alfie Slade from the Obesity Health Alliance. Alfie is a public affairs manager, and Food Active is actually a long-standing and proud member of the Obesity Health Alliance. So we're delighted that Alfred can join us to share details of their recent 10-year strategy that will look to promote healthy weight. So Alfie, it's over to you with a presentation entitled The Policy Impact of Obesity Stigma.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can all see the slides now. So good morning, everyone, and my name is Alfie Slade, and I'm speaking to you on behalf of
Alfie, we can't see the slides, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Yeah, we can.
Oh, there's now visible. Great, thank you. So yes, thank you very much, everybody. For those of you who are not familiar with the Obesity Health Alliance, we are a coalition of over 45 health charities, campaign groups, and medical royal colleges focused on supporting evidence-informed population-level policies to help address the wider environmental factors that lead to excess body weight. We at the OHA have just launched our latest major report, the Turning the Tide strategy, which outlines tangible recommendations for structural evidence-informed policies to support population-level healthier weights over the next 10 years. The reason we support these policies is because the measures that treat obesity as solely or primarily a matter of personal responsibility are not only based on inaccurate information, as we've heard extensively so far already today, but they're also ineffective. So when we were looking at this matter, when we were developing our report, we found that the first government target to reduce obesity prevalence in England was set in 1991. And since then, there have been 14 government health strategies focused on obesity that set targets for obesity reduction in England, containing 689 policy recommendations. Not one of these targets has ever been met, and obesity prevalence has only increased between 1991 and now. Until 2020, all of these strategies had a clear focus on treating obesity as a matter of personal responsibility, either explicitly or implicitly, built around the idea of eat less, move more, which we've heard discussed extensively today so far. It must be noted that
Alfie, just to let you know, your slides don't seem to be moving through at all.
Yes, sorry, I'm still on the first slide. So yes, the first government obesity strategy was introduced in 1991. Our report was aimed to identify why these previous strategies have failed and what can be done differently to ensure that future strategies succeed. And weight stigma goes a long way to answering those questions. Our overall conclusion can be best summarised in the words of one of our expert advisors, Professor Rachel Batteram. Quote, "The assumption that our body weight is totally under our voluntary control goes against scientific evidence and results in public health policies that focus entirely on personal responsibility, incorrect messaging in the media, and undermines access to evidence-based treatments that would improve the health of people living with obesity. Ending weight stigma is paramount, not only from a human rights and social justice standpoint, but to advance the prevention and treatment of obesity." There's one aspect of obesity on which most media, government, surveys, political debates, and public engagement efforts concur. Something must be done to address the UK's high and rising prevalence of obesity. This is usually where the agreement ends. Among health experts and academics, there is a developing strong consensus and consistent support for understanding that obesity is a consequence of many interconnecting factors, with rising trends being more related to structural failures and social inequalities rather than personal choice or lack of willpower. However, there are more mixed opinions amongst the public and in Parliament, and media coverage too often focuses on individual responsibility, blaming individuals, and in the case of childhood obesity, parents, rather than acknowledging the multiple drivers of the condition. The accompanying imagery often actively dehumanizes people with obesity, portraying them from behind, headless, or acting in ways that suggest they are deliberately fueling their condition. Over 2/3 of images accompanying media reports in the period surveys related to weight were found to be stigmatizing in this way. The prevailing misconception that a person's body weight is a matter of personal choice alone, that obesity is a choice that can be reversed easily and rapidly by eating less and moving more, reinforces negative stereotypes of people living with obesity, portraying them as lazy, gluttonous, or lacking willpower. When the public, policymakers, and the media believe that obesity is caused by greed and lack of willpower, they are more likely to think that it can be addressed by policies that target only the individual, and policies that try to make whole of society changes end up being seen as unfairly restrictive or politically impractical to implement. These ineffective, often stigmatizing personal responsibility policies in turn reinforce the public's inaccurate perceptions that obesity is completely within people's individual control. This is the cycle that we have found ourselves in for the last 30 years and goes a long way to explain why in that time we've had 14 government obesity strategies, all of which focus primarily on personal responsibility and all of which have failed to meet their objectives. This is a cycle we must break, and it can only be achieved by tackling the simplistic, inaccurate, and harmful misinformation and stereotypes underpin obesity stigma. A very clear example of this in practice was seen just a few weeks ago when a backbench member of the House of Lords asked an oral question about the government's obesity policy. Lord Robertson, a backbench Conservative peer, used the question to attack the government's obesity policy. He called for a greater focus on personal responsibility and stated that it should not be, quote, socially acceptable to be overweight. His exact words were, quote, is it not time, perhaps, to revert to the situation when I was young, when it was not socially acceptable to be grossly overweight and push individual responsibility? The government's policy should tell people they must not eat so much, end of quote. I'm sure I do not need to deconstruct why this statement is inaccurate and damaging. Despite this member of the House of Lords having no background in health, his previous role as a minister was not in the health department, and presenting no evidence for his claims, his statement received wide coverage in the media, far beyond the coverage normally extended to a simple question in the House of Lords, hundreds of which are asked every month. There's a BBC article in front of me here, but this was covered in many, many outlets. Views like this, particularly when held by people in positions of power and amplified by the media, feed into stigma amongst the general public, and in turn put pressure on government to pursue ineffective policies, which again, in turn, give these stigmatizing views legitimacy. This is just one example of where one individual's outdated, stigmatizing, and inaccurate views about obesity impact policymaking. Whilst my focus today has been on how obesity stigma contributes to poor policymaking, we must never forget that tackling the direct, harmful experiences of stigma that impact people living with obesity on a personal level must be at the forefront of our minds. Other speakers today have addressed these points far more eloquently than I can, so I'll only briefly outline the major areas that we looked at in our report and the recommendations that we developed. We interviewed people living with obesity about their experiences through a number of insight panels and found that every person we interviewed had experienced stigma, ranging from offhand negative comments to full-blown discrimination. This is backed up by the survey previously highlighted by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Obesity, which showed that in England, 88% of people living with obesity reported being stigmatised due to their weight. As we've heard today, the evidence is very clear that weight stigma damages individuals' health, compromises psychological well-being, and increases metabolic risk factors. Stigma also has a profound impact in the workplace, where people living with obesity are less likely to be employed and are on average on lower salaries compared to employees with their weight in the healthy range. Amongst children and young people, there is also clear evidence of the link between weight stigma and poorer educational outcomes, bullying, and isolation. Stigma can also have a profound impact in healthcare settings. It may be a commonly held view that stigma can encourage weight loss, but this is a profound misconception. The reverse is true. When health professionals hold stigmatizing views, this can impact the support and care received by patients and may result in people living with obesity being even more reluctant to seek medical care, both for their obesity and for other conditions as well. This can in turn lead to even further negative health outcomes. A recent study found that around half of people living with obesity in the UK waited more than 6 years after starting to struggle with their weight before having a discussion with healthcare professionals, compared with 3 years in other higher income countries. So what can be done? The COVID-19 pandemic has led to greater public acceptance of government intervention to improve health. Polling by the Health Foundation in mid-2020 revealed that 86% of people in the UK believe the national government has a great deal or a fair amount of responsibility in ensuring that people generally stay healthy, a significant rise from 61% in 2018. On obesity specifically, we at the OHA conducted a survey last year which found that 74% of people supported a renewed drive from government around obesity, and 70% of people agreed that the link between obesity and COVID-19 meant that obesity should be given more of a priority. This is a sharp increase in public polling from 2015. The government has made welcome commitments to address the structural drivers of obesity, such as the proposed restrictions on TV and online advertising of unhealthy food and drink products, which, as Eric correctly mentioned in his answer to an earlier question, are some of the longer term facing policies that can address the environmental factors that lead to obesity. And it is crucial that these initiatives and renewed public support for action are not derailed by persistent stigma around obesity. Better public understanding of the complexities and multiple drivers of obesity must be fostered, including how we shift the narrative away from personal responsibility to wider societal action that can create the right conditions for evidence-informed policies that improve the population's health. This improved understanding will also help reduce the explicit and implicit bias that causes physical and mental harm to so many people living with obesity. To drive this, the government must lead by example in addressing weight bias and stigma, reframing obesity as an issue of collective rather than personal responsibility. This should be reflected in the language, in government campaigns, speeches and policy documents, and campaigns should focus on health promoting behaviours rather than solely on weight loss. People with lived experience of obesity should of course be involved throughout all relevant policy and campaign development processes. And we all have a responsibility to support this in our communications, our actions, our day-to-day behaviours, as well as challenging stigmatising views we see from people in positions of power in an assertive and constructive manner. In particular environments, there is much action that can be done in workplace settings to ensure that greater guidance is available for employers to understand that obesity is within the scope of existing discrimination legislation. In healthcare settings, to enable better training and resources, is to have constructive, mutually beneficial conversations about weight in a way that does not stigmatise and does not alienate people who are looking to access services. And of course, there is an urgent need for media outlets to do more to eradicate damaging practices in terms of framing, language, and the images used around obesity. As has previously been mentioned, there are many well-developed media guidelines and non-stigmatizing banks of images available, and it's really a question of people taking the lead in ensuring that these resources that are available to media are used. Finally, there is a large body of evidence on the impact of stigma, but there's far less exploring effective approaches to reduce stigma. There is a need for much more research to be done into specific policy interventions that can eliminate weight stigma and discrimination in all areas. And in conclusion, we must ensure that there is a better understanding at every level of society of the varied causes of obesity, which in turn will mean that weight stigma of any kind is eliminated in all settings and becomes socially unacceptable. This is both a human rights and social justice necessity, and also a fundamental requirement for future obesity policy making to be successful. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alfie. That's a fantastic overview, and a really good to see that this is part of the OHA's 10-year strategy as well. So I'm going to move on quickly to Dr. Hannah Brinsden from World Obesity Federation. Hannah is the Director of Policy at World Obesity, and she's going to talk through how can we help address weight stigma. So Alfie, if you could take your slides down, then we'll just get Hannah to share her screen with her slides. Thanks very much.
Apologies, I seem to be, I've got pause share, but I don't seem to have end share.
If you just take your slides down, if you just click them off.
Sorry, I'm just being able to be able to share and talk about these things. Share screen.
Thanks very much. Hannah, are you okay to upload now? Brilliant. Thanks.
Okay, can you, oh, hang on, that's not even, can you see them okay now?
Yeah, that's super. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this conference today. It's a pleasure to represent World Obesity Federation today. And being so late on in the programme is great in many ways because everybody's already done all the talking, but bad in other ways because I need to think of something new to say. So I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of how sort of we look at weight stigma and bias at the World Obesity Federation. For those who don't know, the World Obesity Federation is a global civil society organisation. We're a membership organisation with National Obesity Association members all over the world. And we work with our members to advance global obesity policy, shape the narrative on obesity. And we do this through advocacy, we do this through education, we do it through research. And we've been looking at weight stigma for probably as a priority for about 5 years now. It's become something that we've recognised as being really fundamental to what we do as an organisation, and we're increasing our activities accordingly. So weight stigma and bias is really one of the last socially acceptable forms of discrimination. And I think the socially acceptable part here is really, really key to answering the question of what can we do to address weight stigma and bias. There are lots of very sort of specific activities that we can do, for instance, addressing stigma in the media and things like that. But actually, until we change the social understanding of obesity, we're going to really struggle to actually end bias and stigma, because as long as it's acceptable, it's not really going to go away. And I think we know one of the challenges with obesity is that the complexities are just not understood, and this is one of the kind of fueling factors for weight stigma and bias. So why does stigma matter? We've talked about this a lot already this morning. So it impacts people, it has an impact on the people living with obesity, but it also impacts on the kind of policies that we see, as we've just heard, and also the health services that are available. And again, this all really comes down to a lack of understanding about obesity and what we can do about it. This is just a mind map that I can share after, but this shows the kind of all the different ways that weight stigma what can cause it, how it can affect people, and what can exacerbate it across society. I'm not going to go into the detail because I think we've covered this quite a lot today. And similarly, there's a lot of causes and a lot of kind of outcomes of weight stigma. So this misunderstanding about obesity, the personal responsibility narrative, social ideologies, also lack of legislation protecting people from discrimination based on weight, various health campaigns and false stereotypes. And this can cause weight stigma and bias in a number of different areas, including the media, policy, internal bias, which we had an interesting discussion about just before the break, workplace, schools, etc. And this has a wide range of impacts on individuals and, as I say, on health services and on policy. Now, one of the interesting challenges we have at the World Obesity Federation, being a global organisation, is that stigma and bias actually isn't the same everywhere. And in different countries, they experience stigma in different ways, or in some places claim not to have stigma, or that it's seen in a different way. So people first language, first of all, is something that we sort of advocate for and encourage to help change how we label people with obesity, or rather not label people with obesity. However, we work with countries where English isn't their first language, and actually when you translate people living with obesity or something like that, it doesn't work in some languages. And so this presents challenges for us as a global organization where we want to advocate for the best language possible, but if it then doesn't translate, that's something that we need to be aware of in how we frame our messages. And stigma and bias is also not experienced the same everywhere. And maybe this is just a sign of different stages of kind of the obesity trajectory, as it were, in different countries, in high income versus low and middle income countries. But in some countries, you know, weight is very much seen as a sign of wealth. And in some, it's even seen as a sign of specifically of health. And this is some feedback that we've had from countries like South Africa, where they have a history and still do have a lot of HIV. So when somebody is presenting with a higher weight, it's seen there as something which indicates that that person doesn't have HIV and is therefore desirable. And that's not to say it's not desirable, but it's a very different narrative around obesity. And then in some countries, particularly in Africa and places like that, there are still overfeeding practices ahead of marriages and things like that. So weight is very complex. And so when we're looking at this globally, there's a lot of different cultural and socio norms that we also need to consider. However, there is a very strong commonality across all of these, that there is a misunderstanding about obesity, what causes it, what the consequences are, and what we need to do about it. So I think we kind of frame a lot of what we do around this misunderstanding and trying to address that. And I think if we can address some of this misunderstanding and raise awareness of that, we are going to be more successful in addressing weight bias and stigma. So what needs to be done? So we need to address these misunderstandings. We need to recognize the complexity. We need to avoid simplifying or oversimplifying obesity, both at a population and individual level. And this also means kind of reflecting an individual's sort of desire to even lose weight, like Sarah was talking about before, avoiding kind of generalizations. We need to recognize that it's a disease, not just a risk factor. So it is something that warrants treatment, warrants support from healthcare services. And we need to be including people who have experience of obesity, either themselves or within their families, in decisions, in discussions, in policies, because only from hearing these experiences, hearing the stories that we've heard today, can we really try to kind of reshape this understanding or misunderstanding. And I think Stuart mentioned the foresight report in his presentation at the beginning of today. And I think myself included, we're very, very good at referring to the foresight map. It's been around for 15 years or so now. We're very good at talking about it and then very quickly talk about one specific part of it and no longer really talking about the foresight map. So I think we all need to be better at trying to find ways to communicate what we want, even if it's about one aspect of obesity, but keeping it grounded in this kind of complex system to avoid this oversimplifying language that we often use for obesity, which can then cause weight stigma and bias, or if it doesn't cause it, prevent us shifting away from the stigma and bias. So stigma and policy. So one of the problems that we have around stigma, about bias, around the misunderstandings of obesity in policy is that a lot of policy frameworks, decisions are really focused on the personal responsibility narrative. And we have a lack of policy and legislation to improve sort of the environments that we live in, to improve the health services available for people living with obesity. There's a lack of policies for the management and treatment of obesity, a lot of standard access, and this is both, you know, within the UK, but also around the world, and a lack of legislation to protect people from the discrimination that we see in the way that you would for something like ethnicity or gender. So what can we do about this? Well, we can recognize that it's complex and that it's a disease, and that means that it needs a lot of different policy approaches, and that we can only address obesity if we look at all of these together, and that we can't pick and choose, we can't cherry pick. We need to shift the narrative away from personal responsibility. Blame is such a big part of the stigma and bias narrative that we see. that we all have a role to shift away from this, and we can see this reflected in policy, and that's really concerning. We need comprehensive policy frameworks that include prevention, management and treatment. We need to be including people first language where it's appropriate. We know it is appropriate in English, so that's definitely something that we need to be doing, and these little changes and shifts can help kind of move us away. And we need to be engaging people, like I said earlier, with in policy development to make sure that they are actually, appropriate. One of the pieces of work that we're doing at the moment, we have a series of policy dossiers on specific policies on our website. We're currently working on one on weight stigma that we will be publishing later this year, and we will be using that to support policymakers in kind of understanding about bias and stigma and how that can shape their policy objectives. We're also, in line with this, have with a number of our members developed this framework for addressing obesity, really looking at the different elements of sort of treatment, prevention, recognition, avoiding stigma, monitoring it. And we strongly believe that if we can kind of take this holistic approach to obesity, that we can help shape or change the misunderstandings that we see today, which can in turn help reduce the stigma and bias that we commonly see throughout society. So stigma in media, we've talked a lot about this today, and it's such an important area because so many of the messages that we see on a daily basis are from the media. There's a false narrative, there's inappropriate language and terminology, inappropriate images that we see every day. And this is not only really important, but in many ways it's kind of a low-hanging fruit. I think there's some really tangible actions we can do when we're addressing stigma in the media, and I think we can all play a role in that. I'm going to skip through these because we've done a lot of discussion on that already. So image banks, so the World Obesity Federation, we have an image bank, and a number of our members also do, and similarly we have some guidelines for the media around how to talk about obesity, people first language again, and things like that. But also one action that we can all do, everybody who's joined this conference today, is we can call out the media and others when there's inappropriate language and imagery. And it's one of the things, we can't do it all the time at World Obesity Federation. There's so much of it, it's really hard to call out everything. But if we do see a news article or something and it's got really stigmatizing images, we'll either publicly kind of flag it, or we'll direct them to our image bank and kind of suggest that a different image is used. And we have had some success with certain media outlets where they've changed the image or have kind of at a later date used one of our images instead. And similarly, the World Health Organization, we flagged with them some of the images they were using were stigmatizing, and now they've shifted that as well. And I think this is really tangible actions that we can all take, and I think it's really important that we all do, and every little bit can help to shape what is being seen in the media. So then healthcare, we know that patients' weight can significantly affect how they're treated. Many people are sort of put off from seeking medical care because healthcare professionals are not really educated on the causes of obesity. They're not educated in how to speak to people about obesity. And this really is quite damaging for people who are living with obesity in terms of the support and care that they can receive. And in turn, healthcare professionals are actually also subject to bias by patients. So they have this idea that maybe if their GP, if they've decided that they, if they're of a certain weight, they will kind of feel like they can't take advice from them and things like that. And that's problematic as well. So this is quite an interesting dynamic within the healthcare sector. Health centres are not equipped to support people with obesity. Poor equipment and things like that are just not appropriate. So this just, the healthcare service is very stigmatizing, and actually this is really concerning because really the health service should be providing support for people living with obesity. And there's generally a lack of appropriate guidelines about how to treat the complexities of obesity, and talking about the mental health as well as the physical health elements of obesity. And we did some survey work that showed that stigma was one of the key barriers to healthcare services. So this is, as I say, really concerning. So what can we do? We can train healthcare professionals. We have a e-learning program, and we have some content there, which is specifically around how to have a conversation with people about their weight, and also how to treat obesity with its comorbidities. We can raise awareness about obesity, the causes and the consequences. So this comes back to this idea of the misunderstanding obesity. And this, you know, healthcare professionals are also people, so are also exposed to the media, are also exposed to any information campaigns around these causes and complications, but also the negative or concerning campaigns, should I say. So there's a lot that we can do to kind of shape the understanding. And also recognise that obesity is a disease as well as a risk factor. So to summarise, bias and stigma is experienced differently around the world, but one of the common things that we see that drives this is the misconceptions around obesity, or this idea that we can simplify it into one thing. We need to reframe the obesity narrative in order to help end weight stigma and bias. And there are a lot of key areas that we can take action, but healthcare, policy, and media are three of those important areas. And then finally, just to say a few things coming from World Obesity over the next couple of months. As I mentioned, we have a policy dossier on stigma, which is going to have summaries of all sorts of evidence and case studies related to stigma. We've got a survey which we've done of international people on their experiences and perceptions of stigma and obesity, which we will be publishing the first round at the end of the year, early next year. We've got a number of working groups at the moment working on a series of recommendations. Again, these should be published at the end of the year or early next year. And there's also some WHO recommendations on obesity management and treatment, which will be discussed at their executive board in January. And within this, it kind of takes this holistic approach, and there is references to stigma in that document from what I've seen at the moment. So there's a lot going on in this area, in the global space, that we can all kind of learn from. And also, I think it's really reassuring that this is becoming a bigger issue and that it is kind of getting into different areas of life, and we all need to be kind of working to expedite that to try and end weight stigma and bias. Thank you.
Many thanks, Hannah. Fantastic. Really interesting to hear some of those global perspectives as well, in the way in which overweight is perceived. So we're going to turn now from more of that global perspective to a local perspective. We're going to have some short presentations on local action and training to help eliminate or at least reduce weight stigma. So first person we're going to hear from is Alison Feely, who is team leader at the newly formed Office for Health Improvement and Disparity. She's team leader in obesity and healthy weight team. So Alison, over to you. Alison, you may need to unmute. Yeah. Okay.
I was trying to find the mute button. Thanks very much indeed for that help there. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, that's fine.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much. And thanks very much for that introduction. So I'm going to talk you through the development of the Healthy Weight Coach e-learning training program. And it's very timely, isn't it? Because this discussion this morning, there's a lot of focus on healthcare professionals and how to support them to have these sensitive conversations. And so it's very exciting to be able to talk a little bit about this today. But as a way of a background, I'd like to start with the obesity strategy that government published in July 2020, which is where this commitment comes from. One of the commitments in that strategy was to offer primary care networks the opportunity to equip staff to become healthy weight coaches through training delivered by Public Health England. To fulfill several commitments made in the strategy, the government announced an additional £100 million in 2021 to 22 to improve the support available to adults, children and families to achieve and maintain a healthier weight. And this funding was to help expand the availability of weight management services across the country, as well as increase signposting and referrals to services and information. So before I jump into how we developed this training content, I'd just like to give you an overview of the role of the Healthy Weight Coach. It's a new role, it's a voluntary role, and it's targeting individuals working within primary care and primary care networks. And so it's in addition to their substantive roles. So the aim of the Healthy Weight Coach is to engage and support adults living with overweight or obesity, and where relevant, to make positive changes to their health and health behaviours. So we envisage the Healthy Weight Coach by being able to support adults by having conversations about health and well-being, so that extends beyond weight. It's offering, they should be able to offer appropriate evidence-based information, signpost, or where appropriate, refer to appropriate health services or weight management services, and offer follow-up conversations to people during their weight management journey or through their health behaviour journey. So going to the project overview and how we undertook this. So PHE commissioned an external academic provider to undertake the development of the content of this training course. And we were very privileged to work with Stuart Flint and his team on this. They were our provider and technical input into this. So the aim of the project was really to co-create e-learning to supplement and enhance the skills of staff working in primary care to enable them to become a healthy weight coach. In addition to our research project team, which were predominantly from Leeds University and Leeds Beckett University, the Healthy Weight Coach, we had a project steering group that PHE led. We invited other organisations to participate, their technical expertise into this group, and that included the NHS, various colleagues from different teams, including primary care and prevention, the Department of Health and Social Care, and also Health Education England. Health Education England are also responsible for digitising the content for us. We had other stakeholders participate and review the training content. That included staff working in primary care networks, so people working in the front line. Obesity UK and people with lived experiences were also invited to give feedback at various time points, and that was largely facilitated through Stuart and his team. We also had Health Education England, Public Health Workforce colleagues also input. Their input was absolutely invaluable since they work in regions and have experience on the ground. So we really valued that input. In addition to that, we had Public Health England colleagues from different teams, including our Behavioural Insights team, actually comment and feed into our training, in addition to giving a lot of support on the behaviour change elements of this work. So I'm just going to talk you through the project and what we undertook. So it entailed a review of the digital learning that was available on the e-learning for health platform, the consultation with Obesity UK, which was led by Stuart and team, the development of the training content, development of the supporting documentation, which was a really important part of this project. And then also I'll briefly talk about the content evaluation research proposal that's also underway. So this is a useful slide just to reference to Health Education England worked on the healthier weight, actually that should be healthier weight, not healthy, healthier weight competency framework, which is also published on the e-learning for health platform. I think it was published a year before in maybe 2019. And this sets out about 46 competencies for frontline staff around healthier weight and weight management. So this was developed and published, and Stuart and team reviewed this, as well as the content that's already available on the e-learning for health platform, and identified that there were several competencies without available training, and there were some competencies that had partial training, so incomplete training attached to those competencies. And essentially what the findings was from this review was that there were quite a lot of gaps around having sensitive conversations, behaviour change, and weight stigma and discrimination. And this is where we think the Healthy Weight Coach has filled that very large gap. So just to reflect very briefly on the consultation with Obesity UK, essentially the aim of that consultation was to understand the perceptions of people with lived experience of their weight management support and conversations they've had with healthcare professionals. Three themes emerge from this discussion and these discussions, and that these won't be a surprise to anyone in the audience today. So it's experiences of weight stigma in healthcare came up, feeling blame and judgment, and also not time constraints around the conversations with healthcare professionals was also a theme that emerged. But I'd just like to reflect on the last sentence. What would improve your conversations with healthcare professionals? I would like to feel less judged. As I said before, I feel like they think we haven't tried. I have, and I know many people who have, and we still do all the time, but I don't think they believe me. And that was a member from Obesity UK. So those consultations definitely influence very strongly the development of the training content. This slide here gives you an overview of the 8 modules that we developed. So it talks about, there's the role of the healthy weight coach, the complexity of weight gain, obesity and weight management, measuring and assessing weight status, outcomes associated with obesity and weight management. We have a module on healthy eating, drinking and physical activity, but it's a very light module, and we've tried to steer away from difficult or complex conversations around those topics, because as we all know, it's very nuanced. So we've stuck with the Eat Well guide and very basic information, since the healthy weight coach isn't a trained nutrition professional. That's not their role here, but it's about signposting to information that's that will be helpful and scientifically evidenced. So the other 3 modules, avoiding weight stigma and challenging biases, supporting behavior change and how to communicate effectively, those 3 modules we're very proud of. That was where I think a lot of work went in, and we had a lot of input and steer from Stuart and his team and our other stakeholders. And they really did shape those modules incredibly well. And I do look forward to getting feedback from people on those modules in particular. In addition to these 8 modules, there are knowledge checks throughout the sessions, in addition to resources for further reading and further training, and participants are welcome to view those as well. We plan to launch the training very soon, I can't give you a date yet, but it's imminent. But we're going to launch on 2 platforms, the eLearning for Healthcare Hub, which is Health Education's platform, and then also the Personalised Care Institute's platform. This training has been endorsed by them, and if people take the training through that platform, they'll get 2.5 CPD points as well. And we anticipate that the training will take about 160 minutes at least to do. It'll probably take longer if a person views all the additional material. In addition to the training material, we did a lot of work on supporting documentation. We're going to launch the documentation on NHS Futures. This is a reference guide for primary care networks and supervisors of the Healthy Weight Coach. It includes a mapping document, a mapping template that a Healthy Weight Coach can fill in and complete all the available services around behaviour change nationally and locally. It's got a role description as well as a Healthy Weight Coach checklist or crib sheet to remind the learner on how to approach the healthy weight conversations. In addition to that, the next 2 slides will just cover off the content evaluation. We've also commissioned this to be done just after the launch. We are seeking to determine whether the Healthy Weight Coach training achieves its goal of producing confident and competent healthy weight coaches that can discuss weight sensitively with people and advise on available services and relevant information. We've got 4 work packages, which includes, assessing knowledge and confidence around the content. We would like to explore Healthy Weight Coaches' perceptions of the training. We want to find out what might be missing and how the training prepared people to become a healthy weight coach. We're going to be recruiting staff to participate in this research, and if anybody in the audience is interested, please do reach out to us and contact us through the email address that's listed on the slide, wholesystemsobesity@phe.gov.uk. That will be available for the next 6 months, that email address. So please do get in touch with us if you're interested in participating in this research. Thanks very much, Matthew. I'll stop there.
Fantastic, Alison. That really, really interesting. Just a quick question, because I know this has come through on the Q&A. Obviously, this is predominantly focused in terms of healthcare professionals, but we have quite a lot of people in terms of third sector partners and also local authority partners. Are they going to be able to access this resource as well?
It's an excellent question. Thank you for asking that. Yes, they are going to be able to access. We've labeled it green status. So anybody with an email address can set up an account in eLearning for Health and access that particular course. And in addition to that, we are thinking about extending it to broader cadres of workers. And I think some of our research might show that too.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, you know, tier 1, tier 2, etc. I think that's really important, actually. So, okay, thanks very much, and we'll be able to update that through our network, I'm sure, once that gets launched. So, I'm just going to move on now to our second presentation in this final section, and it's from Alison to Alison. It's Alison Milbourne, who is Public Health Manager at Kirklees Council, and Alison's going to talk us through a compassionate approach to tackling obesity, which is known as weight neutral. So Alison, over to you.
Thank you. Can I just check that people can see my screen? Lovely,
yes,
thank you. I'm going to begin this presentation by just giving credit to Doncaster, first of all, and in particular, Carrie Wardle. Carrie introduced the concept of a compassionate stroke weight neutral approach to me and therefore to Kirklees. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. So essentially, we want to try a new approach to issues of weight and health that is driven primarily by compassion. It takes blame away from individuals and it fully acknowledges the mental and financial burden poverty and inequality places on people. So a weight neutral intervention is an intervention or a service where weight change or weight control is not the sole intended outcome. And that actually the evidence suggests that they might not necessarily lose weight, but just hear me out, because that usually puts people off at the beginning. So why do we think we should take a weight neutral approach? Well, let's begin with the weight focused interventions first of all, and what the evidence tells us there, that any gains from initial weight loss are not necessarily sustained over the longer term. We all know of individuals where it has worked, but the majority of people don't manage to keep the weight off. And actually at that 2, 3, 4, 5 year point, they are likely to have regained weight and more very often. We also know, as already been mentioned, weight loss interventions can lead to harmful weight cycling and dysfunctional relationships with food and body. Now, weight neutral interventions, what the evidence tells us there is that the health gains, now you'll notice I've changed my language from weight loss gains to health gains, and that'll become clearer. The health gains are maintained over the longer term. There are better psychological outcomes to this approach, and really, really importantly, there's no evidence of harm. So what this slide demonstrates is just some differences between the two approaches. So a diet weight loss approach, no surprises there. The intention is to achieve body weight loss or body shape change. And we all know the types of things that are going to be included in that approach. And yes, you can expect weight loss and improvement of biochemical markers during the first 12 weeks. But as I've already said, with likely weight regain to the original weight, by the 3 to 5 year point, and also those biochemical markers might also revert to pre-treatment levels. And the risks, as we've already said, development of disordered eating, weight cycling, etc. Now, a weight neutral approach, the idea is to encourage and enable healthy behaviours regardless of current weight status or body shape or size. It might include things like mindful eating training, hunger fullness awareness, experimenting with responding to body cues, pursuit of joyful movement, it's a term I like to use instead of physical activity, and would also include exploring the history of the individual around dieting, and reframing the value of body weight and size. And it might also include psychological support and encouragement. And what we can expect to see is long-term weight stability at the 5-year point, as I've already said, and possible improvements to blood pressure, cholesterol, cortisol levels, etc. And you're likely to see improvements to intuitive eating behaviours, reductions in body dissatisfaction, and sustained joyful movement. The risks with this approach are mainly lack of support from family and friends, because this is such a new concept and we are almost brainwashed as a society into thinking a diet is the only way. The individual might have some initial unease with it because of those long-held dietary beliefs and even some grief due to losing that thin me dream. Now, if I were to tell you that approximately 90% of people, irrespective of where they are in terms of BMI, have got room for improvement in their dietary quality. So my question is, why are we only having conversations with those with a BMI of 25 plus? And the picture is similar in terms of meeting recommended levels of physical activity. So people assume that somebody who is visibly heavier than they would expect are not meeting the recommended levels of physical activity. And this is very often not the case. And neither does BMI necessarily classify who is cardiometabolically healthy and who isn't in terms of BP, cholesterol, insulin, etc. And actually, approximately 50% of people are misclassified. And as we've already said, obesity is actually mostly determined by wider social, economic, commercial and environmental determinants of health, even if it appears to be grounded in individual behaviour, and that's where we've concentrated our efforts in the past. However, when focusing on weight loss, energy deficit is improved, and it's this in turn that will improve the biochemical results, not the weight loss per se. Hope that makes sense. So weight neutral intervention, it would be about being size accepting and encouraging and enabling healthy behaviours regardless of current weight status or body shape. There would be an emphasis on body acceptance and self-worth, and a real focus on health gains and longevity boosters that are independent of weight, size, shape, etc. It would be very much about focusing on regular activity, joyful movement, improving the quality of diet, along with other elements that we know improves health. Example, social support, good quality sleep, not smoking, reduced alcohol consumption, etc. But it would be keeping a process focus rather than on end goals and day-to-day quality of life. It would be maintaining a holistic focus, given that health is multidimensional. It's very much about freedom, about increasing access and opportunity, irrespective of where you're from or what you earn, etc. Because it's essentially rooted in the principles of social justice, aiming to lift up the systematically disadvantaged and challenging the environmental and social structures that create inequalities. Now, for those who still continue to choose to pursue weight loss, we need to ultimately respect the wishes of those individuals and support them to do so. But we can still incorporate principles of weight neutral approaches into that in terms of self-compassion, joyful movement, improving nutrition, etc. But we do need to be really honest with those individuals about the pros and cons of pursuing weight loss, particularly around the longer term evidence and the fact that they will probably be back through that revolving door time and time again. They've probably already been there. So offering a weight neutral approach is offering an alternative. And there may well be some caveats. I don't know the answer to this, that, in terms of individuals that for medical reasons need to lose weight quickly, then maybe a weight neutral approach is not appropriate in those instances. But they are things that we can discuss. So an example of a weight neutral approach is the non-diet approach that's been developed by Fiona Willer. She's an Australian dietitian. At the end of my presentation, I'll include a link to her resources, which you'll find interesting. So that she's developed this as a clinical approach to her health at every size values, and they're around weight inclusivity, health enhancement, respectful care, eating for well-being, and life enhancing. Now, some of these things we've already touched on today. So weight inclusivity, no surprise that it's about accepting and respecting the inherent diversity of body shapes and sizes. Then health enhancement bit is about supporting health policies that improve and equalise access to information and services and personal practices that improve human well-being, including attention to individual physical, economic, social, spiritual, emotional and other needs. We've already touched on the respectful care element, and it's about acknowledging our biases and working to end weight discrimination, weight stigma. And it's about providing information and services from an understanding that socioeconomic status, race, gender, sexual orientation, age and other identities impact upon weight stigma, and we need to support environments that address these inequalities. The Eating for Wellbeing bit, again, it's about promoting flexible and individualised eating based on hunger, based on feeling full, nutritional needs and pleasure. Example, intuitive eating, rather than externally regulated eating plans focused on weight control. And the life enhancing movement is about supporting joyful movement that allow people of all shapes and sizes to engage in activities that they enjoy. So the final slide here, assumptions are made that heavier people are unhealthy. This is not necessarily so. Weight loss through dieting is not sustainable over time in the majority of people. By taking this approach, we'd be acting on behalf of our population if we centralise health for people at all points along the weight continuum and work to eradicate stigma in all settings, including healthcare. Weight loss leads to body preoccupation and it distracts from other health goals and wider determinants. It reduces self-esteem, it leads to eating disorders and other health decrements, weight stigmatisation and discrimination. And the last 2 points are crucial for me. It would negate the need for people to have embarrassing conversations about weight with adults and children. GPs tell us they don't bring up the subject because they're embarrassed about it. I'm saying we don't need to do that. Have a positive conversation about joyful movement, good quality nutrition, and the same applies to NCMP, which has been discussed earlier as well, and the difficulties associated with those letters that go out after children have been weighed and measured. You don't need to do that. It needs to be a conversation with all families about the importance of healthy behaviours. And that's the link to Fiona Willer's resources, should anybody be interested. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alison. Really interesting how that ties into the earlier discussion that we had around NCMP. Very interesting perspective. Thanks so much for that. So if you just pop your slides down, we're going to move on to the final presentation from this session. That's going to be a presentation from Gemma Holdsworth and Jill Harrison of Bolton NHS Foundation Trust, and they're going to talk about health gains approach in a 0 to 19 service. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Matthew. Can you all see the slides?
Yeah, that's great.
Great. Well, it's great to follow on from Alison there because our approach is something very similar. Hello, I'm Gemma Holdsworth, and Jill Harrison, as you can see, will also be presenting with me today. And we're practitioners working directly with families in Bolton. Addressing weight stigma is something that we are incredibly passionate about. And in the last 12 to 18 months, we've been putting into place several steps that actively seek to address weight stigma for our families within our 0 to 19 service. So we'd like to share with you what those steps are. So what do we know about weight stigma in children? I think a lot of this has come up this morning. We know that childhood is where weight stigma begins, and it starts early, with research showing that an anti-fat bias can develop in children as young as 2 years old. Weight stigma experiences are most frequent in childhood and have the highest amounts of associated distress. We know that 66% of our young people report to either feeling negative or very negative about their bodies most of the time. Weight-based bullying is the most problematic form of bullying in the classroom. And as it's been said this morning, we know that weight-based stigma does exist within NHS services. But what about the actual lived experience for a child or a young person in a bigger body? And I think Angela's account this morning was incredibly impactful. This is another account taken by an article by a lady called Aubrey Gordon. And she's reflecting on the moment she was told by a health professional that she was in fact overweight. She was 9 years old at the time, which is the average age of the children who access our service. This quote had such a powerful impact on us, especially the part where she says, "The sense of failure and self-loathing it inspired planted the seeds of a depression I would live with for many years." This got us really thinking about what kinds of seeds were we planting in the children that we work with. So we started to re-examine some of our practices. So the main thing that we addressed first was to look at our actual approach. Circumstances at the time with COVID meant that our delivery was on hold, Therefore, we had a period of being able to reflect and do some research. This helped us to see that some of our historic ways of working with families did have the potential to cause further stigmatisation. Evidence shows that a focus on weight or BMI in children can cause psychological harm. Weight-focused interventions have been shown to lead to stigmatisation, body dissatisfaction, disordered eating practices, and lower self-esteem. So for these reasons, we took an approach similar to Alison's called health gains. And this is basically where we place the focus and the aims on the sustainable healthy habits and behaviours rather than getting that child to reach a certain BMI centile or a certain weight. We also recognise, as this has come up a lot today, we recognise how powerful language is around this issue. So we developed a communication model to guide health professionals in how to communicate growth measurements to parents without labelling or stigmatising. The coaching that we provide is based upon motivational interviewing techniques, and it uses a strengths-based lens. So we're really starting with what families are already doing really well, and then we're building on that. So once we had the approach in place, we then had to disseminate it. And this was done through three main ways. So firstly, by putting a framework in place for our trust. Secondly, by providing ongoing training. And thirdly, by putting the approach into the interventions that we were providing for our families. So to put the framework in place, we wrote some guidelines for the trust and we had these ratified. These guidelines have specific sections around weight stigma, bias and discrimination, the importance of language, and the health gains approach. They also make a recommendation of not measuring children too frequently, unless of course there is a particular medical need to do that. We felt that twice a year is enough to give that pattern or trajectory of growth without being used as weight or BMI reduction monitoring. So in order to raise awareness and challenge weight-based assumptions and bias, we rolled out training for all of our 0 to 19 workforce and our wider workforce in this approach and in the communication model. So far, we've trained 250 members of staff and we're still providing regular training all year round. We've also started offering training for schools and other agencies in this approach and how they can address weight stigma in their setting. So far, we've been absolutely delighted with the feedback we've received and lack of resistance towards this approach. Actually, what we have noticed is that our colleagues across the disciplines are actually quite enthused by it and they're often quite relieved by the messages. So while I was working on the guidelines and the training, Jill was working on redesigning the content of our intervention. So I'm going to hand over to Jill now to tell you more about that part.
Oh, well, thank you, Gemma. You can hear me, can't you?
Yeah.
So programs, yes. Way back before lockdown, we used to deliver lifestyle programs face-to-face with family groups. And of course, with lockdown, this all had to change. And so we needed to create an online offer. But with our new awareness of the consequences of weight stigma, we knew that the program's approaches, although they were really well-intentioned, had the potential to cause harm, and that we couldn't just replicate these approaches in our new offer. And so, with more research into alternative approaches, we created our new core programme for the families of primary age children, so up to 11 years. We created short motion graphic videos that we release weekly to our parents, and we follow up with a coaching call each week. Now, we just completed our pilot programme at the end of September, and we're now on to our second cohort of families, so it's still really new to us. But we thought it might be useful to share some of the changes in our approach that address weight stigma. And so what we are moving away from is, first of all, parent and child participation, because although this was heaps of fun and really interactive, the kids knew that they were there because of their body size. We've also moved away from body size changes being a measured outcome. We no longer do pre and post measurements. We've moved away from prescriptive messaging, telling parents and kids what they should be eating, what they should be doing, and away from us being the experts prescribing our solutions. So instead, we're moving towards coaching the parent only. And we've found that coming alongside the parent and responding to their specific strengths and the issues as well within each family as we guide them through the programme, we can support changes more effectively. And instead of body size, we focus on those health behaviours that have been mentioned. Habits that are achievable, they're sustainable, they're process outcomes that are shown to support health outcomes. We're supporting parents, of course, in nutrition awareness and in offering a variety of food, but we have a primary focus on developing the skills of role modelling, of structuring meals, of positive feeding practices, and how to have helpful conversations about body diversity with their child. And we encourage kids and adults to be the experts in their own bodies and to learn how to tune into those interoceptive body signals like hunger and fullness. These are the prerequisites of self-regulation as children grow towards independence. And so in essence, our programs are about relationships within the family, particularly at mealtimes, positive relationships with food and eating, and relating to their bodies with appreciation and respect. This is the feedback from one of our parents who completed the pilot programme. And it's the mum of a 9-year-old boy with ADHD and selective eating. And she said, "This has transformed our mealtimes. Stressful mealtimes are now chilled. Her boy is now willing to try new foods without parental interference. And so his variety is increasing. And he's stopped sneaking and hiding food. He's dropped that preoccupation." And this isn't the only family to suggest positive changes. So in summary, while we can't change the stigmatizing environment around us overnight, we can help families to develop resilience and the skills to make home a place where children have great relationships, where they grow in a stable way, and move towards independence with self-regulation and body appreciation. Thanks for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Gemma. Just quickly, Jill, I think there's going to be a lot of people who'll be interested in this. Actually, it's a really interesting program and approach. So how can they follow up and possibly find further information on this?
I guess, well, what do? Do we leave details with Beth?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, but there's nothing that's web-based or anything that people could look at.
No,
or
not at the
approach you
moment.
directly. Yeah.
No, we don't have social media and we don't have a web at the moment.
Okay.
So yeah, but we're happy
to.
Our contact details are on the first slide. So if you send in the slides out, people can get in touch with us that way.
Fantastic. Thanks to you both. That was a really interesting conversation. So I'm finally going to turn to Food Active's own Beth Bradshaw. Beth is a Food Active project manager, and she's going to just talk through and launch our Weight Stigma Resource Hub. So Beth, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you to everybody, all our speakers today, and particularly then Gemma and Jill for leading me on to this presentation. I'm just going to be rounding off the conference today with a little bit of outlining some of our work that we've done or continuing to work on weight stigma, some next steps for us, some next steps for you as attendees of this conference, and also the launch of the new resource hub that Matt Ashton mentioned at the very start of this conference, which feels like a while ago now because it was. Thank you to everyone who stuck with us to the end, and I really appreciate it's been a long session, so I'm going to try and keep this nice and short so we can take a break at 1 o'clock. So just thought it'd be useful to just give a quick overview of kind of our work today on weight stigma. Over the last 18 months or so, it's been something we've continued to develop our work programme on. We're constantly learning. This conference is a learning process for us as well as a team. We're always trying to reflect internally on about what we're doing and how we can improve and support our wider network to help eliminate weight stigma. And one area of work that we've really tried to focus our efforts on is our local authority declaration on healthy weight, which some of you may or may not be aware of, but it's a cross-council commitment take steps to promote healthy weight across their local populations. And it takes a massive focus on the wider determinants of health rather than that individual focused narrative that's been mentioned so often today. So we really try to focus and look within this project of work on what we could do better. So we actually launched the declaration last year. It's about 6 or 7 years old now, and lots changed in those years. So we actually did a refresh last year, and within that refresh, we addressed weight stigma within one of the 16 commitments. So that is now part of the council's commitment to start working towards. We also developed the communications guide for the declaration and how to support accurate communication and understanding of the declaration, both from internally within councils, but also for their local populations as well. We published other resources such as evidence briefing and position statements. And also we launched our checklist last year, earlier this year on World Obesity Day, and worked with colleagues from the city councils. So thanks to Emma and Liz, who, if they're on the call today, for their support on that checklist. And that's essentially designed to give, if you were a writer of coming from any background, to give them confidence to ensure that anything that they're publishing or writing is free from stigmatizing language and imagery, for all the things that we've talked about today. So it's a bit of a one-stop shop we tried to create earlier this year. Since then, we've been busy planning this conference, obviously, but we've also been working in partnership with Public Health England North East as well to deliver a couple of stakeholder mapping workshops. And this was a small group of local authority public health teams. And we really wanted to start exploring the different sectors and where they saw the biggest issues in terms of weight stigma, or kind of who needs to be sensitised to this issue, realising that a lot of our following, a lot of our current practices within public health, and wanted to try and take this a step further and kind of sensitise other sectors to it. So we had a fantastic workshop just last month. It's a little Myra map that we did together, and we're going to hopefully deliver another one very soon, and just try and kind of keep picking people's brains and understanding what we can do and who needs to hear why addressing weight stigma is important. And then also, whilst we're developing this conference, we realised we've got quite a number of resources, and we also kind of wanted to compile them all together in one place on our website. So we're launching our resource hub, our weight stigma resource hub today at the conference. And on this hub, it's a compilation of our own existing resources. We've also got a couple of new resources on there in terms of a weight stigma presentation, and also some existing resources that I've just mentioned before. But we've also compiled some of the fantastic resources that are available out there. We've got lots on there from World Obesity that Hannah was talking about before. They've got some fantastic image banks. They've got other communication guidelines, all sorts of stuff. So we've also got external links as well, and that's kind of separated up into healthcare, children and families, policy, and also media as well. So I do encourage you to take a look at that. The link is on page 16 of your conference programs if you'd like to check it out after the conference. And in terms of next steps, I just wanted to quickly run through what our commitments are to post-conference to help keep the momentum up on tackling weight stigma. So firstly, we are going to continue to work with our local authority network to help prevent weight stigma, raise awareness of the complexities of obesity that we've talked about so much today, and within council departments, but also Commission for Weight Management Services as well, which I feel like we really do need to focus on, and also system leaders as well. We really want to share good practice on local initiatives, policies and campaigns, and that's kind of what this last section was really about, is just hearing from a couple. Obviously there's lots more out there, but we really wanted to share a couple of local practice as well. So we want to share that on our resource hub, and we'll continue to update that. If anybody has got any case studies that they want to submit to us, I really encourage you to get in touch with me. I'd love to share them on that resource hub, and we just really want to make sure that others can learn from different approaches that can help to reduce weight stigma. Continue to produce some resources on communicating the importance of eliminating weight stigma, ensuring the services are inclusive and how they can be achieved. And finally, we want to lobby national government to ensure future health policies focus on the wider determinants and shift away from that simplistic narrative on reducing obesity, and also lobbying around ensuring those campaigns, communications encourage person-centred language and no stigma-free imagery. And that's kind of really in line with the Obesity Health Alliance's strategy that they published just last month. If any organisation is interested in working with us, I really encourage you to get in touch with us. Like I said before, we really would love to hear from everyone across the country about any work that's going on locally. Also, in terms of how we can work better as well. So please do get in touch with us. And just finally, want to finish off with a challenge for you as attendees for the conference, and to take away with you today. Firstly, really encourage you to check out our Weight Stigma Resource Hub. Check out some of the fantastic resources on there from Food Active, but also from some of the other brilliant organisations as well. We really want you to start considering some actions that you could take within your own organisations or personal life in the short term. So Hannah mentioned before, some of them can be really short term, can be really quick wins. Things like person-centered language and utilising those image banks can be a really, really great first step and can be very easily implemented. And then in the longer term, we'd really encourage you to start looking at what you can do, taking that, but Bill and Gemma were talking about before, just taking a step back and reflecting on your own practices, and realising that, you know, some things are made in good intentions, but understanding where those services or policies could be improved. So that could be developing communication guidelines, in-house policy statements, delivering training sessions, or making that a core training offer, that sort of thing. And I will be following up in the follow-up survey tomorrow and asking you what some of these actions might be, because I'd really like to gauge an understanding of what some attendees from this conference may be doing after this conference finishes in a couple of minutes' time. So going to finish off with a thank you to all our delegates who've tuned into the call today. I'm going to hand back over to Matthew now, who's going to finish us off.
Thanks very much, Beth. Thanks for launching the Weight Stigma Resource Hub, but also thanks to you personally in terms of all the work that you've done in terms of arranging, coordinating this conference, planning it. It's been a big task, and we have had a huge amount of content, some incredibly interesting presentations, real diversity of presentations today, and Beth has been responsible for pretty much putting all of that together. So thanks to her, and thanks to our wider Food Active and Health Equalities group team. It's very much been a team thing. So how to sum up? Well, we're 1 minute past 1. So thanks to all of our speakers for their contributions today and for their time preparing and delivering the presentations, and obviously to all of our delegates for joining us. I hope you found it useful and appreciate the time that you've taken out of your to join us. There will be a full recording, and presentations will be circulated to all attendees via email next week. And as Beth mentioned just now, there's going to be a very short survey we'll send you tomorrow, so please do complete that, as your feedback is really valuable to us. So for anyone who hasn't already subscribed, please do subscribe to our monthly newsletter to receive all the latest updates from the programme, and to follow us on social media. That's @Food Active. Thanks again for everyone to join us today, and hopefully we'll see you again this time next year for our 2020 conference. Thank you and